A Flower Wedding by Walter Crane. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Barbara Crockett. Yes, flower bells rang right merry that day, when there was a marriage of flowers, they say. Young lad's love had courted Miss Meadow Sweet, and the two soon agreed at the altar to meet. A lily-white robe was worn by the bride, and sweet William the groom, dressed in red at her side. Miss Violet, Primrose, and gay Marigold, with their ladies' fingers her train did uphold. In lady smocks, bridesmaids, forget-me-not blue, with their sashes all tied in love not true. The bride's mother follows with loving eye bright, all in winter green and fine furs bedight. Whilst her father looked young, though with old man's beard, was a dandelion in youth, I've heard. The troth was plighted for woe or for weal, and the lines attested by Solomon's seal. The bachelor's button was cast aside, and the throng that witnessed was London's pride. There was a good King Henry, a tall jonquil, like Narcissus himself by the waters still. There were lords and ladies to grace the dance, and Rose Mary and Rose LaFrance. With his golden rod the sweet sultan came, lastly creeping Jenny, an elderly dame. To order the feast there was ling and hart's tongue, and goosefoot with sage, the houseleek among, very sweet peas and good cherry pie, such a feast as an alderman could not deny. In lovely king cups there was chamomile tea, and the fortune in gifts was a wonder to see. A new penny royale, a fine golden feather, a pair of horse chestnuts, a Jacob's ladder, Venus's looking-glass, a fine arrowhead, discovered long since in the river's bed, garments of flax, and a lady's cushion, hose in hose ladies' slippers put on, buttercups gold, and a pitcher plant, nay, everything that a house could want. In Venus's flytrap the pair drove away. "Speed well and be happy," their friends gaily say. But alack, what a hubbub, when one chanced to find the bride's only box was there left behind. The wild time they had, and the fuss that was made, kept the guests in a rout through the deadly nightshade. But the clocks ticked apace to the ope of daisy, snowflakes were fast falling when all said goodbye. With regrets for that box, yet they need not to stint, for the bridegroom was rich, he'd a post at the mint. End of A Flower Wedding by Walter Crane. Book of Nonsense by Edward Lear. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Barbara Crockett. Poem 1. There was an old man with a beard, who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren, have all built their nests in my beard." Poem 2. There was a young lady of Ryde, whose shoestrings were seldom untied. She purchased some clogs and some small spotty dogs, and frequently walked about Ryde. Poem 3. There was an old man with a nose, who said, "If you choose to suppose that my nose is too long, you are certainly wrong." That remarkable man with a nose. Poem 4. There was an old man on a hill, who seldom, if ever, stood still. He ran up and down in his grandmother's gown, which adorned that old man on a hill. Poem 5. There was a young lady whose bonnet came untied when the birds set upon it. But she said, I don't care, all the birds in the air are welcome to sit on my bonnet. Poem 6. There was a young person of Smyrna whose grandmother threatened to burn her, but she seized on the cat and said, Granny, burn that, you incongruous old woman of Smyrna. Poem 7. There was an old person of Chile whose conduct was painful and silly. He sate on the stairs eating apples and pears, that imprudent old person of Chile. Poem 8. There was an old man with a gong, who bumped at it all the day long, but they called out, Oh, law, you're a horrid old bore, so they smashed that old man with a gong. Poem 9. There was an old lady of Chersley, who made a remarkable curtsy. She swirled round and round till she sunk underground, which distressed all the people of Chertsey. Poem 10. There was an old man in a tree, who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, Does it buzz? He replied, Yes, it does. It's a regular brute of a bee. Poem 11. There was an old man with a flute. A sarpent ran into his boot. But he played day and night till the sarpent took flight, and avoided that man with a flute. Poem 12. There was a young lady whose chin resembled the point of a pin, so she had it made sharp, and purchased a harp, and played several tunes with her chin. Poem 13. There was an old man of Kilkenny, who never had more than a penny. He spent all that money in onions and honey, that wayward old man of Kilkenny. Poem 14. There was an old person of Isha, whose conduct grew friskier and friskier. He danced hornpipes and jigs, and ate thousands of figs, that lively old person of Isha. Poem 15. There was an old man in a boat, who said, I'm afloat, I'm afloat. When they said, No, you ain't, he was ready to faint, that unhappy old man in a boat. Poem 16. There was a young lady of Portugal, whose ideas were excessively nautical. She climbed up a tree to examine the sea, but declared she would never leave Portugal. Poem 17. There was an old man of Moldavia, who had the most curious behavior. For a while he was able, he slept on a table, that funny old man of Moldavia. Poem 18. There was an old man of Madras, who rode on a cream-colored ass, but the length of its ears so prompted his fears, that it killed that old man of Madras. Poem 19. There was an old person of Leeds, whose head was infested with beads. She sat on a stool and ate gooseberry fool, which agreed with that person of Leeds. Poem 20. There was an old man of Peru, who never knew what he should do, so he tore off his hair and behaved like a bear, that intrinsic old man of Peru. Poem 21. There was an old person of Hurst, who drank when he was not athirst. When they said, You'll grow fatter, he answered, What matter? That globular person of Hurst. Poem 22. There was a young person of Crete, whose toilet was far from complete. She dressed in a sack, spickle-speckled with black, that umbelliferous person of Crete. Poem 23. There was an old man of the Isles, whose face was pervaded with smiles. He sung Hi Dum Diddle, and played on the fiddle, that amiable man of the Isles. Poem 24. There was an old person of Buddha, whose conduct grew ruder and ruder, till at last with a hammer they silenced his clamor by smashing that person of Buddha. Poem 25. There was an old man of Columbia, who was thirsty and called out for some beer. But they brought it quite hot in a small copper pot, which disgusted that man of Columbia. Poem 26. There was a young lady of Dorking, who bought a large bonnet for walking, but its color and size so bedazzled her eyes, that she very soon went back to Dorking. Poem 27. There was an old man who supposed that the street door was partially closed, but some very large rats ate his coats and his hats, while that feudal old gentleman dozed. Poem 28. There was an old man of the West, who wore a pale plum-colored vest. When they said, "Does it fit?" he replied, "Not a bit," that uneasy old man of the West. Poem 29. There was an old man of the Wrekin, whose shoes made a horrible creaking, but they said, "Tell us whether your shoes are of leather, or of what, you old man of the Wrekin." Poem 30. There was a young lady whose eyes were unique as to color and size. When she opened them wide, people all turned aside and started away in surprise. Poem 31. There was a young lady of Norway, who casually sat in a doorway. When the door squeezed her flat, she exclaimed, "What of that?" This courageous young lady of Norway. Poem 32. There was an old man of Vienna, who lived upon tincture and senna. When that did not agree, he took chamomile tea, that nasty old man of Vienna. Poem 33. There was an old person whose habits induced him to feed upon rabbits. When he'd eaten 18, he turned perfectly green, upon which he relinquished those habits. Poem 34. There was an old person of Dover, who rushed through a field of blue clover, but some very large bees stung his nose and his knees, so he very soon went back to Dover. Poem 35. There was an old man of Marseille, whose daughters wore bottle green veils. They caught several fish, which they put in a dish, and sent to their pa at Marseille. Poem 36. There was an old person of Cadiz, who was always polite to all ladies, but in handing his daughter he fell into the water, which drowned that old person of Cadiz. Poem 37. There was an old person of Basing, whose presence of mind was amazing. He purchased a steed, which he rode at full speed, and escaped from the people of Basing. Poem 38. There was an old man of Quebec. A beetle ran over his neck, but he cried, "With a needle I'll slay you, old beetle," that angry old man of Quebec. Poem 39. There was an old person of Fillet, whose conduct was scrubious and wily. He rushed up a palm when the weather was calm, and observed all the ruins of Fillet. Poem 40. There was a young lady of Bute, who played on a silver gilt flute. She played several jigs to her uncle's white pigs, that amazing young lady of Bute. Poem 41. There was a young lady whose nose was so long that it reached to her toes. So she hired an old lady, whose conduct was steady, to carry that wonderful nose. Poem 42. There was a young lady of Turkey, who wept when the weather was murky. When the day turned out fine, she ceased to repine, that capricious young lady of Turkey. Poem 43. There was an old man of Apulia, whose conduct was very peculiar. He fed 20 sons upon nothing but buns. What a whimsical man of Apulia. Poem 44. There was an old man with a poker, who painted his face with red ochre. When they said, "You're a guy," he made no reply, but knocked them all down with his poker. Poem 45. There was an old person of Prague, who was suddenly seized with the plague. They gave him some butter, which caused him to mutter, and cured that old person of Prague. Poem 46. There was an old man of the north, who fell into a basin of broth, but a laudable cook fished him out with a hook, which saved that old man of the north. Poem 47. There was a young lady of Poole, whose soup was excessively cool, so she put it to boil by the aid of some oil, that ingenious young lady of Poole. Poem 48. There was an old person of mold, who shrank from sensations of cold, so he purchased some muffs, some furs, and some fluffs, and wrapped himself from the cold. Poem 49. There was an old man of Nepal, from his horse had a terrible fall, but though split quite in two, by some very strong glue, they mended that man of Nepal. Poem 50. There was an old man of the Bruzy, so blind that he couldn't his foot see. When they said, "That's your toe," he replied, "Is it so?" That doubtful old man of the Bruzy. Poem 51. There was an old person of Rhodes, who strongly objected to toads. He paid several cousins to catch them by dozens, that feudal old person of Rhodes. Poem 52. There was an old man of Peru, who watched his wife making a stew, but once by mistake in a stove she did bake, that unfortunate man of Peru. Poem 53. There was an old man of Melrose, who walked on the tips of his toes, but they said, "It ain't pleasant to see you at present, you stupid old man of Melrose." Poem 54. There was a young lady of Lucca, whose lovers completely forsook her. She ran up a tree and said fiddle-dee-dee, which embarrassed the people of Lucca. Poem 55. There was an old man of Bohemia, whose daughter was christened Euphemia, till one day to his grief she married a thief, which grieved that old man of Bohemia. Poem 56. There was an old man of Vesuvius, who studied the works of Vitruvius. When the flames burnt his book, to drinking he took, that morbid old man of Vesuvius. Poem 57. There was an old man of Cape Horn, who wished he had never been born. So he sat on a chair till he died of despair, that dolorous man of Cape Horn. Poem 58. There was an old lady whose folly induced her to sit in a holly, whereon by a thorn, her dress being torn, she quickly became melancholy. Poem 59. There was an old man of Corfu, who never knew what he should do, so he rushed up and down till the sun made him brown, that bewildered old man of Corfu. Poem 60. There was an old man of the south, who had an immoderate mouth, but in swallowing a dish that was quite full of fish, he was choked, that old man of the south. Poem 61. There was an old man of the Nile, who sharpened his nails with a file, till he cut off his thumbs, and said calmly, "This comes of sharpening one's nails with a file." Poem 62. There was an old person of Rheims, who was troubled with horrible dreams, so to keep him awake they fed him with cake, which amused that old person of Rheims. Poem 63. There was an old person of Cromer, who stood on one leg to read Homer. When he found he grew stiff, he jumped over a cliff, which concluded that person of Cromer. Poem 64. There was an old person of Troy, whose drink was warm brandy and soy, which he took with a spoon by the light of the moon, in sight of the city of Troy. Poem 65. There was an old man of the Dee, who was sadly annoyed by a flea. When he said, "I will scratch it," they gave him a hatchet, which grieved that old man of the Dee. Poem 66. There was an old man of Dundee, who frequented the top of a tree. When disturbed by the crows, he abruptly arose and exclaimed, "I'll return to Dundee." Poem 67. There was an old person of Tring, who embellished his nose with a ring, He gazed at the moon every evening in June, that ecstatic old person of Tring. Poem 68. There was an old man on some rocks, who shut his wife up in a box. But she said, "Let me out!" He exclaimed, "Without doubt, you'll pass all your life in that box." Poem 69. There was an old man of Coblentz, with length of whose legs was immense. He went with one prance from Turkey to France, that surprising old man of Coblentz. Poem 70. There was an old man of Calcutta, who perpetually ate bread and butter, till a great bit of muffin, on which he was stuffing, choked that horrid old man of Calcutta. Poem 71. There was an old man in a pew, whose waistcoat was spotted with blue, but he tore it in pieces to give to his nieces, that cheerful old man in a pew. Poem 72. There was an old man who said, "How shall I flee from this horrible cow? I will sit on this stile, and continue to smile, which may soften the heart of that cow." Poem 73. There was a young lady of Hull, who was chased by a virulent bull, but she seized on a spade and called out, "Who's afraid?" which distracted that virulent bull. Poem 74. There was an old man of Whitehaven, who danced a quadrille with a raven, but they said, "It's absurd to encourage this bird," so they smashed that old man of Whitehaven. Poem 75. There was an old man of Leghorn, the smallest as ever was born, but quickly snapped up he was once by a puppy, who devoured that old man of Leghorn. Poem 76. There was an old man of the Hog, whose ideas were excessively vague. He built a balloon to examine the moon, that deluded old man of the Hog. Poem 77. There was an old man of Jamaica, who suddenly married a Quaker, but she cried out, "Oh, lack, I have married a black," which distressed that old man of Jamaica. Poem 78. There was an old person of Dutton, whose head was so small as a button, so to make it look big he purchased a wig, and rapidly rushed out about Dutton. Poem 79. There was a young lady of Tyre, who swept the loud chords of a lyre. At the sound of each sweep she enraptured the deep, and enchanted the city of Tyre. Poem 80. There was an old man who said, "Hush! I perceive a young bird in this bush." When they said, "Is it small?" he replied, "Not at all. It's 4 times as big as the bush." Poem 81. There was an old man of the East, who gave all his children a feast, but they all ate so much, and their conduct was such, that it killed the old man of the East. Poem 82. There was an old man of Kamschatka, who possessed a remarkably fat cur. His gait and his waddle were held as a model to all the fat dogs in Kamschatka. Poem 83. There was an old man of the coast, who placidly sat on a post, but when it was cold he relinquished his hold, and called for some hot buttered toast. Poem 84. There was an old person of Bangor, whose face was distorted with anger. He tore off his boots, and subsisted on roots. That borassable person of Bangor. Poem 85. There was an old man with a beard, who sat on a horse as he reared, but they said, "Never mind, you will fall off behind, you propitious old man with a beard." Poem 86. There was an old man of the West, who never could get any rest, so they set him to spin on his nose find his chin, which cured that old man of the West. Poem 87. There was an old person of Annerley, whose conduct was strange and unmannerly. He rushed down the strand with a pig in each hand, but returned in the evening to Annerley. Poem 88. There was a young lady of Troy, whom several large flies did annoy. Some she killed with a thump, some she drowned with a pump, and some she took with her to Troy. Poem 89. There was an old man of Berlin, whose form was uncommonly thin, till he once by mistake was mixed up in a cake, so they baked that old man of Berlin. Poem 90. There was an old person of Spain, who hated all trouble and pain, so he sat on a chair with his feet in the air, that umbrageous old person of Spain. Poem 91. There was a young lady of Russia who screamed so that no one could hush her. Her screams were extreme. No one heard such a scream as was screamed by that lady of Russia. Poem 92. There was an old man who said, "Well, will nobody answer this bell? I have pulled day and night till my hair has grown white, but nobody answers this bell." Poem 93. There was a young lady of Wales who caught a large fish without scales. When she lifted her hook, she exclaimed, "Only look!" That ecstatic young lady of Wales. Poem 94. There was an old person of Cheadle, was put in the stocks by the beadle, for stealing some pigs, some coats, and some wigs, that horrible person of Cheadle. Poem 95. There was a young lady of Welling, whose praise all the world was a-telling. She played on the harp and caught several carp, that accomplished young lady of Welling. Poem 96. There was an old person of Tartary, who divided his jugular artery. But he screeched to his wife, and she said, "Oh, my life, your death will be felt by all Tartary." Poem 97. There was an old person of Chester, whom several small children did pester. They threw some large stones, which broke most of his bones, and displeased that old person of Chester. Poem 98. There was an old man with an owl, who continued to bother and howl. He sat on a rail and imbibed bitter ale, which refreshed that old man and his owl. Poem 99. There was an old person of Gretna, who rushed down the crater of Etna. When they said, "Is it hot?" he replied, "No, it's not." That mendacious old person of Gretna. Poem 100. There was a young lady of Sweden, who went by the slow train of Weedon. When they cried, "Weedon Station," she made no observation, but thought she should go back to Sweden. Poem 101. There was a young girl of Majorca, whose aunt was a very fast walker. She walked 70 miles, and leaped 15 stiles, which astonished that girl of Majorca. Poem 102. There was an old man of the Cape, who possessed a large Barbary ape, till the ape one dark night set the house on a light, which burned that old man of the Cape. Poem 103. There was an old lady of Prague, whose language was horribly vague. When they said, "Are these capes?" she answered, "Perhaps," that oracular lady of Prague. Poem 104. There was an old person of Sparta, who had 25 sons and 1 daughter. He fed them on snails, and weighed them in scales, that wonderful person of Sparta. Poem 105. There was an old man at an easement, who held up his hands in amazement. When they said, "Sir, you'll fall," he replied, "Not at all," that insipidant old man at a casement. Poem 106. There was an old person of Burton, whose answers were rather uncertain. When they said, "How d'ye do?" he replied, "Who are you?" that distressing old person of Burton. Poem 107. There was an old person of Ems, who casually fell into the Thames. And when he was found, they said he was drowned, that unlucky old person of Ems. Poem 108. There was an old person of Ewell, who chiefly subsisted on gruel. But to make it more nice, he inserted some mice, which refreshed that old person of Ewell. Poem 109. There was a young lady of Parma, whose conduct grew calmer and calmer. And they said, "Are you dumb?" She merely said, "Hum?" That provoking young lady of Parma. Poem 110. There was an old man of Asta, who possessed a large cow, but he lost her. But they said, "Don't you see? She has rushed up a tree, you invidious old man of Asta." Poem 111. There was an old man on whose nose most birds of the air could repose, but they all flew away at the closing of day, which relieved that old man and his nose. Poem 112. There was a young lady of Clare, who was sadly pursued by a bear. When she found she was tired, she abruptly expired, that unfortunate lady of Clare. End of Book of Nonsense by Edward Lear. Recording by Barbara Crockett.
The Magician's Tea Party by Evelyn Sharp. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little King Wistful slipped through the palace gates and went out into his kingdom to look for something new. He was only 8 years old, so he was not a very big king. But he had been king as long as he could remember, and he had been looking for something new the whole time. Now, his kingdom was entirely made of islands, and in the days when the old king and queen were alive, these islands were known as the Cheerful Isles. But King Wistful changed their names soon after he came to the throne, and insisted on their being called the Monotonous Isles. For, strange as it may sound, this little king of 8 years old thought his kingdom was the dullest and the ugliest and the most wearisome place in the world, and nothing that his nurses or his counselors could do ever succeeded in making him laugh or play like other little boys. "Only look at the stupid things," muttered His Majesty impatiently, as he stood and surveyed his kingdom from the top of a small grassy hillock. 5 round islands in a row. Always 5 round islands in a row. If only some of them were square, it would be something. At the bottom of the hill was a wood, one of those pale green baby woods, where the trees are young and slender, and nothing grows very plentifully except the bracken and the heather. And as the king stood and felt sorry for himself at the top of the hill, out from the wood at the bottom of the hill came the sound of a little girl's voice, singing a quaint little song. And this was the song: "Sing song, don't be long, wistful, wistful, come and play. Sing song, it's very wrong to stay and stay and stay away. The world is much too nice a place to make you pull so long a face. It's full of people being kind, and full of flowers for you to find. There's heaps of folks for you to tease, and all the naughtiness you please. To sulk is surely a waste of time, when all those trees are yours to climb. Ting-a-ring, make haste, king, I've something really nice to say. Ting-a-ring, a proper king would not make me sing all day." King Wistful thrilled all over with excitement. Was something really going to happen at last? He had hardly time to think, however, before the little singer came out of the wood into the open. She wore a clean white pinafore, and on her head was a large white sunbonnet. And under the sunbonnet were 2 of the brightest brown eyes the king had ever seen. He stepped down the hill towards her, wondering how anything so pretty and so merry could have come into his kingdom, and at the same instant the little girl saw the king, and came running up the hill towards him, so it was not long before they stood together hand in hand, halfway down the hillside. "Where did you come from, and who are you, and how long have you been here?" said the king breathlessly. "I am Eyebright, of course," answered the little girl, smiling, "and I've been here always." "Who taught you to sing that song about me?" demanded the king. "The magician," answered Eyebright, "and he told me to sing it every day until you came. But you have been a long time coming." "I'm very sorry," replied His Majesty apologetically. "You see, the magician did not tell me to come. In fact, I don't even know who the magician is." "Are you not the king, then?" asked Eyebright, opening her great brown eyes as wide as they would go. The little king felt it was hardly necessary to answer this, but he set his heels together and took off his crown and made her the best bow he had learned at his dancing class, just to show beyond any doubt that he was the king. Eyebright still looked a little doubtful. "Then how is it that you do not know the magician?" she asked him. "What is the use of being king if you do not know everybody who lives in your kingdom?" "It isn't any use. I never said I wanted to be king, did I?" said His Majesty a little crossly. It was not pleasant to find that somebody else, and only a little girl in a sunbonnet, knew more about his kingdom than he did. "What a very funny boy you are," remarked Eyebright without noticing his crossness. "I always thought it must be so splendid to be a king, and to have a banquet whenever you like, and never to go out without a procession, and to wear a crown instead of a sunbonnet, and—" "That's all you know about it," interrupted the king somewhat impolitely. "There aren't any banquets, and when there are, you only have stupid things with long names to eat, and you never know whether to eat them with a fork or a spoon, and it's always wrong, whichever you do. And if you ask for jumbles or chocolate creams or plum cake, you're told you mustn't spoil your dinner. And all the procession you ever get is a procession of nurses who won't even let you step in a puddle if you want to. Dear me, said Eyebright, you're no better off than a little boy in an ordinary nursery. The little king drew himself up on tiptoe with great dignity. Some of your remarks are most foolish, he said. You forget that I have a kingdom of my own as well as a nursery. To be sure, he added sadly, it is not much to boast of, for it is a very stupid kingdom, and nothing nice ever happens in it. What do you mean? Exclaimed Eyebright. Your kingdom is the nicest kingdom in the whole world. King Wistful had managed to keep his temper so far, but this was more than he could bear. Rubbish, he cried, completely forgetting his royal manners. You come up the hill with me, and I'll show you what a stupid kingdom it is. So they raced up to the top of the hill and looked down at the 5 round islands in a row. There, said King Wistful. Did you ever see anything so dull? The little girl shook her head. I think it is all as pretty as it can be, she said. Look how the sun glints on the cornfields, and see the great red and blue patches of flowers. But they're always the same flowers, complained His Majesty, yawning. They're supposed to be the same flowers, but they never are, answered Eyebright. If you were to pick them, kings never pick flowers, he replied haughtily. Perhaps that is why you know so little about them, retorted Eyebright, and His Majesty began to feel he was not getting the best of it. Anyhow, he continued hastily, you must own that the sea never changes. Oh, said Eyebright, that is because you've not learned the sea properly. It has ever so many faces, and ever so many different voices, too. The king turned and stared at her. Are you a witch? He asked wonderingly. No, laughed Eyebright merrily. If I were, I would make you see things right instead of wrong. Then she suddenly scampered down the hill again. Come along, quick, she cried. We'll go and ask the magician to disenchant you. King Wistful had to run his hardest to catch her, for the little girl in the sunbonnet certainly knew how to put one foot in front of the other. But then a sunbonnet is not so apt to tumble off a person's head as a crown, and that makes all the difference in a running race. Where does the magician live? He panted when he came up with her. In the middle island, she answered. We'll find the boat and follow the river down to the sea. She plunged into the wood as she spoke, and threaded her way through the slender young trees, with His Majesty close at her heels. Sometimes the bracken was as tall as she was, but the boy behind could always see the sunbonnet bobbing up and down just ahead of him, and he followed it until they came out at the other side of the wood and found themselves on the banks of a charming little river. A small round boat like a tub, lined with pink rose leaves, was waiting for them, and into this they both jumped. Oh, oh! cried Eyebright, jumping up and down with delight. The fairies are out today. Look at them, the purple ones in the loosestrife, and the pink and white ones in the comfrey, and— You'll upset the boat if you don't sit still, interrupted the king, who felt cross because he could not see the fairies. Let me have the oars, and I'll take you down the stream. You need not do anything of the sort, said Eyebright, for this is the boat the magician gave me, and it always takes you wherever you want to go. So they just sat in the sunshine and floated lazily along, and they dabbled their hands in the water and made their sleeves as wet as they pleased, and they caught at the branches above as they passed under them, and they leaned over the side and stretched after everything that grew out of reach, and, in short, if they had not been in a ferry boat, it is very certain that they would have tumbled into the water several times before they reached their journey's end. Presently the river widened out into the big calm sea, and after that the boat quickened its speed and took them across to the middle island in no time at all, for the fairies know well enough that nobody wants to dawdle about in an open sea, where there are no tadpoles to catch and no trees that sweep their branches down to meet the water. When the boat stopped, they found themselves on the edge of a shore covered with sea lilac and yellow poppies and wonderful shells that sang without being put to anyone's ear, and just a little way along the beach was the magician's cave. There was no doubt about it being the right cave, for over the door of it was written in square acid tablets, "This is the magician's cave." Besides, the whole cave was dug out of a solid almond rock, and of course any other person's cave would have been made of plain rock without any almonds in it. "Come along," said Eyebright, and the two children walked up the beach and knocked at the magician's door and went in. Some people might think that a cave on the seashore would be full of draughts and jellyfish and wet shrimps, but this particular cave was just like the nicest room that ever belonged to a castle in the air. The wonder of it was that whoever went into it found the very things he never had and always wanted, and none of the things that he'd always had and never wanted. So Eyebright immediately found a beautiful storybook with a colored picture on every page, and all the sad stories squeezed between the happy stories, so that no one who read it could ever cry for long at a time, while the king found the inside of a clock waiting to be picked to pieces, and an open pocket knife with a bit of firewood lying handy, and a full-rigged schooner ready to be sailed. And they both saw the dear old magician sitting in his armchair and smiling at them. He was dressed in a long cloak that always began by being a green cloak, but changed every other minute to a different color according to the mood the magician was in. And as he was always in a nice mood, whether it was a sad or a merry one, his cloak always managed to be a nice color. On his head was a high pointed hat with crackers sticking out of it, and a pattern worked all over it in caramels and preserved cherries. And he wore fairy fox gloves on his hands to keep them warm, because he was not so young as he used to be. He had been practicing as a magician for over 1,000 years, but he did not look very old for all that. He was what might be called pleasantly old, for he had soft white hair and a curly white beard and a pink complexion like a schoolboy's. That is how a magician grows old when he has always been a jolly magician. Eyebright ran straight up to him and climbed on his knee and hugged him. "I've brought the king to see you," she announced, "and we want you to be a nice, kind, lovely magician and help him to be disenchanted." The magician stood up and shook hands with the king, just to make him feel at home, and the boy did not feel shy another minute, and quite forgot that he had never paid a visit before without a procession of nurses to look after him. "You are very good children to call on me at tea time," said the magician. "If there is one thing more than another that makes me feel the ache in my bones, it is having tea all by myself. Now, would you like to have it on the floor, or shall I call up a table?" The king, who had had his meals on a table all his life, voted for the floor. But when Eyebright said it would be more fun to see what would happen if they chose the table, he had to own that perhaps she was right. What happened was very simple. The magician just stamped on the floor, and a neat little table, covered with a nice white cloth, walked in at the door like any person and took up its position in the middle of the floor. "Well," exclaimed Eyebright, "I never knew tables could walk before." "What do you suppose they have 4 legs for?" asked the magician, smiling. "My nursery table does not walk," observed the little king. "Ah," said the magician wisely, "some tables do not know how to put 2 and 2 together. Now for some chairs." He stamped the floor again, and 2 little armchairs bustled into the room as fast as their fat little legs could carry them. "You must excuse their being in such a hurry," said the magician. "They have been playing at musical chairs all their lives, you see. Now, while you are laying the table, I will boil the kettle. Crockery in the left-hand cupboard and eatables in the right-hand cupboard." So the magician set to work and lighted the fire with peppermint sticks, and the 2 children opened the doors of his wonderful cupboards. The crockery in the left-hand cupboard was the right sort of crockery, for none of it matched, so it did not take a minute to find a small pink cup and a green saucer for Eyebright, and a big blue cup and a red saucer for the magician, and a nice purple mug without any saucer at all for King Wistful. As for the right-hand cupboard, the little king was overjoyed when he found it stocked with jumbles and chocolate creams and plum cake. "I am glad," he said with a sigh of relief, "that you don't keep seed cake in your cupboard. Seed cake always reminds me of 11 o'clock in the morning." "Ah," said the magician, "the wymps saw to that when they filled my cupboard for me centuries ago. There's never any bread and butter in it either, until you've had as much plum cake as you can eat." That was a delightful tea party. The magician did not mind in the least when they made polite remarks about the food, and told him his jumbles might have been kept a little longer with advantage, or that his chocolate creams were not quite so soft as some they had known. But they hastened to add that his tea was the nicest tea they had ever tasted, because it had only a grown-up amount of milk in it, so he would have been rather a cross magician if he had minded. Nor did he raise any objection when they walked about in the middle of tea, and took a look at the picture book, or whittled away at the piece of firewood, or danced round the cave and shouted because everything was so nice. And after tea, there were all the magician's treasures to be turned out of odd nooks and corners and left about on the floor, and all his new quill pens to be tried, and his clean sheets of notepaper to be scribbled over. And when they were tired of exploring the cave, and had eaten as much plum cake as they wanted, the magician saw it was the right moment to begin telling them really true stories. And as he was a magician, of course his true stories were all fairy stories, which, as everyone knows, are the only true stories in the world worth believing. But even the stories came to an end at last, and then both the children remembered at once why they had come to see the magician. "Well, what can I do for you?" he asked before they had time to say anything, for truly he would not have been a magician at all if he had not known what they were thinking about. He smiled so encouragingly that the little king answered him at once. "It's like this," he began. "There's something wrong with the way I see things." "Of course there is," said the magician. "The wymps threw dust in your eyes when you were a baby, and you cannot expect to see things in the same light as other people when the wymps have once thrown dust in your eyes." "Why did they throw dust in my eyes?" asked little King Wistful. "Usual reason," answered the magician briefly. "They were not asked to your christening, that's all. If people will persist in leaving the wymps out when they give a party, they must take the consequences. However, as you are not to blame in the matter, the wymps would be the first to own that you ought not to be bewymped any longer. The best thing you can do is go up to Wympland yourself and ask them to take away the spell." The little king looked at Eyebright and hesitated. "It is a long way to go all alone," he remarked, and Eyebright immediately stepped up to him and took his hand. "I'll come with you," she said. "I've always longed to go to the other side of the sun. How are we to get there, magician?" "Well," answered the magician, "the usual way is to climb up a sunbeam, but that's not very quick, and sunbeams are apt to be slippery in the dry weather. Shall I send you up in a flash of lightning, or on the spur of a lark?" "Spur of a lark?" echoed the king. "You mean on the spur of a moment, don't you?" "Not a bit of it," answered the magician. "You'd never get up to Wympland on the spur of anything but a lark, I can tell you. You have to get up there very early in any case if you want to be even with the wymps, so the best way is to rise with the lark. However, as it is getting rather late in the day for larks, I'd better send you up in a lightning flash. Will you manage it alone, or shall I send a conductor with it?" "Will the conductor show us the way?" asked Eyebright. "Dear me, no," said the magician. "Lightning conductors never show anything but the stupidity of some people. Perhaps you'd better have the lightning without a conductor. So stand on one side while I pick you out a nice quiet flash without any thunder hanging to it." He took down a large sack labeled Storms from the shelf, untied the top, and plunged his head into it. Eyebright stole a little closer to the king than before, and hoped that nothing would go off with a bang. "I say," said His Majesty, putting his arm around her, "it strikes me—" "That is impossible," interrupted the magician in a stuffy voice from the middle of the sack, "for I've got it in both hands, and it isn't going to strike anybody so long as you treat it kindly. Now, off you go in a flash." And off they did go in something, though they never knew what it was, for they had no time to see anything before they found themselves dropped with a thud on the other side of the sun. For a moment or two they just lay there where they'd fallen without moving. Then they sat up and rubbed their eyes and looked round. "Oh!" exclaimed Eyebright, clasping her hands tight. "I had no idea it was like this." Of course, Eyebright knew no more about Wympland than she had learned in her geography lessons, and we all know how little geography books ever tell us about the really nice places in the world. So, although she knew as well as any other little girl that Wympland has no physical features and its inhabitants have no occupation, that its climate is dull and foggy and its government is a sleeping monarchy, she was not in the least prepared for what she did see. "Well," said a voice somewhere near, "what do you think of it?" Just in front of them a wymp was standing on his head, which is a wymp's favorite way of resting his legs. He seemed to expect an answer, so the king did his best to think of one that should be both polite and truthful. As a matter of fact, he did not think much of Wympland at all. It is rather full of fog, isn't it?" he began a little nervously. The wymp looked distinctly hurt, but before he had time to get angry, Eyebright put things right in her quiet little way. "I don't think it is yellow fog," she said. "It is more like dull sunshine." The wymp fairly wimpled when he heard this. "You've hit it," he cried in a delighted tone. "That's what it is, really. It's the folks from the front of the sun who call it yellow fog. They're blinded by their own sunshine, they are. This is the back of the sun, you see, and the sunshine naturally loses a bit of its polish by the time it's worked through. I think I like the bright sunshine best, observed the king. That's absurd, said the wymp. Why, you can't look at it without blinking to begin with. In Wympland, you get all the advantages of the sun and none of the drawbacks. No sunblinds, or sunstrokes, or sunspots. You must be a stupid boy if you can't see that. It's your fault, not mine, answered the king boldly. You shouldn't have thrown dust in my eyes if you wanted me to see Wympland in the right light. The wymp turned several somersaults to show his amazement at the king's words, and finally stood thoughtfully on one leg. That's serious, he said. We didn't know you'd ever come up here, or we shouldn't have done it. However, it can't be helped now, so you better go back again. It doesn't matter if you do see things wrong at the front of the sun. But it does matter, they both exclaimed, and that's why we want you to take away the spell, please. The wymp stood on his head again and shook it from side to side, which no one but a wymp could have done, considering the awkwardness of the position. There's only one thing to be done, he said at last. You must exchange eyes. They stared at the wymp and then at each other. The little king began to think busily, but Eyebright spoke without thinking at all. Very well, she said. How is it to be done? Quite easy, answered the wymp cheerfully. All you've got to do is wish with all your might to have the king's eyes instead of your own, and there you are. At that moment, the king finished his thinking. Stop, he shouted. If I take her eyes away, she will always see things wrong. But the king had spoken too late. Eyebright had already wished with all her might, and her eyes had turned as blue as deep water, while his majesty's were round and large and brown. What fun! She cried, laughing happily. Isn't it a nice change to have somebody else's eyes? The little king, however, was far too furious to listen to her. Stand up and let me knock you down, he cried, shaking his fist at the wymp. Look at what you've done. She will see things wrong to the end of her days. Don't be a foolish little boy, said the wymp calmly. Take her home and try to see things right yourself. The king certainly did not take her home, nor himself either. But it is the truth that they both found themselves the very next minute standing on the top of the small green hillock and looking down at the kingdom of the monotonous isles. Hurrah! Shouted King Wistful, waving his crown joyfully. What a beautiful kingdom I've got! Look how the sun glints on the cornfields, and see the great red and blue patches of flowers. Don't you think it is a beautiful kingdom? She added, turning to the little girl in the sunbonnet. Eyebright was distinctly puzzled. She thought she only saw 5 round islands in a row, but of course it was impossible that the king should be mistaken. So she looked once more over the kingdom of the monotonous isles, and then back at the anxious face of the little king. Yes, she said softly, it is, as you say, a beautiful kingdom. Then she ran down the hill and disappeared among the slender trees of the baby wood, and little King Wistful went home to bed. There is a queen now, as well as a king of the monotonous isles. She has black hair and blue eyes, and she wears a crown instead of a sunbonnet, and she quite agrees with the king whenever he tells her how beautiful their kingdom is. And if this should seem remarkable to some people, it need only be remembered that the queen sees everything with the king's eyes. End of The Magician's Tea Party by Evelyn Sharp. Read by Colleen McMahon.
One Eye, Two Eyes, and Three Eyes by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings can be found in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Temiah Rockwell. One Eye, Two Eyes, and Three Eyes by the Brothers Grimm. There once was a woman who had 3 daughters, the eldest of whom was called One Eye because she had only one eye in the middle of her forehead, and the second, Two Eyes, because she had 2 eyes like other folk, and the youngest, Three Eyes, because she had 3 eyes, and her third eye was in the center of her forehead. Now, as Two Eyes saw just as other human beings did, her sisters and her mother could not endure her. They said to her, "You with your 2 eyes are no better than common folk. You do not belong to us." They pushed her about, and threw old clothes to her, and gave her nothing to eat but what they left, and did everything they could to make her unhappy. It came to pass that Two Eyes had to go out into the fields and tend to the goat. but she was still very hungry because her sisters had given her little to eat. She sat down on a ridge and began to weep, and so bitterly that 2 streams ran down from her eyes. And one day, when she looked up in her grief, a woman was standing beside her who said, "Why are you weeping, little Two Eyes?" Two Eyes answered, "Have I not reason to weep when I have 2 eyes like other people, and my sisters and mothers hate me for it, and push me from one corner to another, throw old clothes at me, and give me nothing to eat but the scraps they leave? Today they have given me so little that I am still very hungry." Then the wise woman said, "Wipe away your tears, Two Eyes, and I will tell you something to stop your ever suffering from hunger again. Just say to your goat, 'Bleat, bleat, my little goat, bleat. Cover the table with something to eat.' And then a clean, well-spread little table will stand before you, with the most delicious food upon it, of which you may eat as much as you are inclined. And when you have had enough, and have no more need of the little table, just say, 'Bleat, bleat, my little goat, I pray,' and take the table quite away, and then it will vanish again from your sight." Hereupon the wise woman departed. But Two Eyes thought, "I must instantly make a trial, and see if what she said is true, for I am far too hungry." And she said, "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, bleat. Cover the table with something to eat." And scarcely had she spoken the words than a table covered with a white cloth was standing there, and on it was a plate with a knife and fork and a silver spoon, and the most delicious food was there also, warm and smoking as if it had just come out of the kitchen. Then Two Eyes said a little prayer she knew, "Lord God, be with us always. Amen," and helped herself to some food, and enjoyed it. And when she was satisfied, she said, as the wise woman had taught her, "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, I pray, and take the table quite away." And immediately the little table and everything on it was gone again. "What a delightful way of keeping house," thought Two Eyes, and was quite glad and happy. In the evening, when she went home with her goat, she found a small earthenware dish with some food, which her sisters had set ready for her, but she did not touch it. Next day she again went out with her goat, and left the few bits of broken bread which had been handed to her lying untouched. The first and second time that she did this, her sisters did not notice it, but as it happened every time, they did observe it, and said, "There is something wrong about Two Eyes. She always leaves her food untasted. She used to eat up everything that was given to her. She must have discovered other ways of getting food." In order that they might learn the truth, they resolved to send One Eye with Two Eyes, when she went to drive her goat to the pasture, to watch what Two Eyes did while she was there, and whether anyone brought her things to eat and drink. So when Two Eyes set out the next time, One Eye went with her and said, "I will go with you to the pasture and see that the goat is well taken care of and driven to where there is food." But Two Eyes knew what was in One Eye's mind, and drove the goat into high grass and said, "Come, One Eye, we will sit down and I will sing something to you." One Eye sat down and was tired with the unaccustomed walk and the heat of the sun, and Two Eyes sang constantly, "One Eye, wakest thou? One Eye, sleepest thou?" until One Eye shut her one eye and fell asleep. As soon as Two Eyes saw that One Eye was fast asleep and could discover nothing, she said, "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, bleat. Cover the table with something to eat," and seated herself at the table and ate and drank until she was satisfied. Then again she cried, "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, I pray, and take the table quite away," and in an instant all was gone. Two Eyes now awakened One Eye and said, "One Eye, you want to take care of the goat and yet go to sleep while you are doing it. In the meantime the goat might run all over the world. Come, let us go home again." So they went home, and again Two Eyes let her little dish stand untouched. And One Eye could not tell her mother why she would not eat it, and to excuse herself said, "I fell asleep when I was out." Next day the mother said to Three Eyes, "This time you shall go and watch if Two Eyes eats anything when she is out, and if anyone fetches her food and drink, for she must eat and drink in secret." So Three Eyes went to Two Eyes and said, I will go with you and see that the goat is taken proper care of, and driven where there is food. But Two Eyes knew what was in Three Eyes' mind, and drove the goat into high grass and said, "We will sit down, and I will sing something to you, Three Eyes." Three Eyes sat down and was tired with the walk and with the heat of the sun, and Two Eyes began the same song as before, and sang, "Three Eyes, are you waking?" But then, instead of singing, "Three Eyes, are you sleeping?" as she ought to have done, she thoughtlessly sang, "Two Eyes, are you sleeping?" and sang all the time, "Three Eyes, are you waking? Two Eyes, are you sleeping?" Then two of the eyes which Three Eyes had shut and fell asleep, but the third, as it had not been named in the song, did not sleep. It is true that Three Eyes shut it, but only in her cunning, to pretend it was asleep too, but it blinked and could see everything very well. And when Two Eyes thought that Three Eyes was fast asleep, she used her little charm. "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, bleat, cover the table with something to eat," and ate and drank as much as her heart desired, and then ordered the table to go away again. "Bleat, bleat, my little goat, I pray, and take the table quite away." And Three Eyes had seen everything. Then Two Eyes came to her, waked her, and said, "Have you been asleep, Three Eyes? You are a good caretaker. Come, we will go home." And when they got home, Two Eyes again did not eat, and Three Eyes said to the mother, "Now I know why that proud thing there does not eat. When she is out, she says to the goat, 'Bleat, bleat, my little goat, bleat, cover the table with something to eat.' And then a little table appears before her covered with the best of food, much better than any we have here. When she has eaten all she wants, she says, 'Bleat, bleat, my little goat, I pray, and take the table quite away,' and all disappears. I watched everything closely. She put two of my eyes to sleep by using a charm, but luckily the one in my forehead kept awake." Then the envious mother cried, "Do you want to fare better than we do? The desire shall pass away." And she fetched a butcher's knife and thrust it into the heart of the goat, which fell down dead. When Two Eyes saw that, full of sorrow, she went outside and seated herself on the ridge of grass at the edge of the field, and wept bitter tears. Suddenly the wise woman once more stood by her side and said, "Two Eyes, why are you weeping?" "Have I not reason to weep?" she answered. "The goat which covered the table for me every day when I spoke your charm has been killed by my mother, and now I shall again have to bear hunger and want." The wise woman said, "Two Eyes, I will give you a piece of good advice. Ask your sisters to give you the entrails of the slaughtered goat, and bury them in the ground in front of the house, and your fortune will be made." Then she vanished, and Two Eyes went home and said to her sisters, "Dear sisters, do give me some part of my goat. I don't wish for what is good, but give me the entrails." Then they laughed and said, "If that is all you want, you may have it." So Two Eyes took the entrails and buried them quietly at evening in front of the house door, as the wise woman had counselled her to do. Next morning, when they all awoke and went to the house door, there stood a wonderful, magnificent tree with leaves of silver and fruit of gold hanging among them, so that all in the wide world there was nothing more beautiful or precious. They did not know how the tree could have come there during the night, but Two Eyes saw that it had grown up out of the entrails of the goat, for it was standing on the exact spot where she had buried them. Then the mother said to One Eye, "Climb up, my child, and gather some of the fruit of the tree for us." One Eye climbed up, but when she was about to lay hold of one of the golden apples, the branch escaped from her hands, and that happened each time, so that she could not pluck a single apple, let her do what she might. Then said the mother, "Three Eyes, do you climb up? You with your three eyes can look about you better than One Eye." One Eye slipped down, and Three Eyes climbed up. Three Eyes was not more skilful, and might search as she liked, but the golden apples always escaped her. At length the mother grew impatient and climbed up herself, but could grasp the fruit no better than One Eye or Three Eyes, for she always clutched empty air. Then said Two Eyes, "I will go up. Perhaps I may succeed better." The sisters cried, "You indeed, with your 2 eyes, what can you do?" But Two Eyes climbed up, and the golden apples did not get out of her way, but came to her hand of their own accord, so that she could pluck them one after the other, and she brought down a whole apronful with her. The mother took them away from her, and instead of treating poor Two Eyes any better for this, she and One Eye and Three Eyes were only envious because Two Eyes alone had been able to get the fruit. They treated her still more cruelly. It so befell that once, when they were all standing together by the tree, a young knight came up. "Quick, Two Eyes!" cried the two sisters. "Creep under this and don't disgrace us." And with all speed they turned an empty barrel, which was standing close by the tree, over poor Two Eyes, and they pushed the golden apples which she had been gathering under it too. When the knight came nearer, he was a handsome lord, who stopped and admired the magnificent gold and silver tree, and said to the two sisters, "To whom does this fine tree belong? Anyone who will bestow one branch of it on me may, in return for it, ask whatsoever he desires." Then One Eye and Three Eyes replied that the tree belonged to them, and that they would give him a branch. They both tried very hard, but they were not able to do it, for every time the branches and fruit moved away from them. Then said the knight, "It's very strange that the tree should belong to you, and yet you should still not be able to break a piece off." They again insisted that the tree was their property. Whilst they were saying so, Two Eyes rolled a couple of golden apples from under the barrel to the feet of the knight, for she was vexed with One Eye and Three Eyes for not speaking the truth. When the knight saw the apples, he was astonished, and asked from whence they came. One Eye and Three Eyes answered that they had another sister who was not allowed to show herself, for she had only two eyes like any common person. The knight, however, desired to see her, and cried, "Two Eyes, come hither." Then Two Eyes, quite cheered, came from beneath the barrel, and the knight was surprised at her great beauty, and said, "You, Two Eyes, can certainly break off a branch of the tree for me." "Yes," replied Two Eyes, "that I certainly shall be able to do, for the tree belongs to me." And she climbed up, and with greatest ease broke off a branch with beautiful silver leaves and golden fruit, and gave it to the knight. Then said the knight, "Two Eyes, what shall I give you for it?" "Alas," answered Two Eyes, "I suffer from hunger and thirst, grief and want, from early morning till late night. If you would take me with you and deliver me from these things, I should be happy." So the knight lifted Two Eyes on his horse, and took her home with him to his father's castle. There he gave her beautiful clothes, and meat and drink to her heart's content, and as he loved her so much he married her, and the wedding was solemnized with great rejoicing. When Two Eyes was thus carried away by the handsome knight, her two sisters grudged her good fortune in downright earnest. "The wonderful tree, however, remains with us," thought they, "and even if we can gather no fruit from it, everyone will stand still and look at it, and come to us and admire it. Who knows what good things may be in store for us?" But the next morning the tree had vanished, and all their hopes were at an end. And when Two Eyes looked out of the window of her own little room, to her great delight it was standing in front of it, and so it had followed her. Two Eyes lived a long time in happiness. One day two poor women came to her castle, and begged for alms. She looked in their faces and recognized her sisters, One Eye and Three Eyes, who had fallen into such poverty they had to wander about and beg their bread from door to door. Two Eyes made them welcome and was kind to them, and took care of them, so that they both, with all their hearts, repented of the evil that they had done in their youth to their sister. End of One Eye, Two Eyes, and Three Eyes by the Brothers Grimm. Recording by Temiah Rockwell.
Prince Cherry from the Fairy Book by Miss Mulock. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Long ago there lived a monarch who was such a very honest man that his subjects entitled him the Good King. One day, when he was out hunting, a little white rabbit, which had been half killed by his hounds, leaped right into his Majesty's arms. Said he, caressing it, This poor creature has put itself under my protection, and I will allow no one to injure it." So he carried it to his palace, had prepared for it a neat little rabbit hutch, with abundance of the daintiest food, such as rabbits love, and there he left it. The same night, when he was alone in his chamber, there appeared to him a beautiful lady. She was dressed neither in gold, nor silver, nor brocade, but her flowing robes were white as snow, and she wore a garland of white roses on her head. The good king was greatly astonished at the sight, for his door was locked, and he wondered how so dazzling a lady could possibly enter, but she soon removed his doubts. "I am the fairy Candide," said she, with a smiling and gracious air. "Passing through the wood, where you were hunting, I took a desire to know if you were as good as men say you are. I therefore changed myself into a white rabbit, and took refuge in your arms. You saved me, and now I know that those who are merciful to dumb beasts will be 10 times more so to human beings. You merit the name your subjects give you. You are the good king. I thank you for your protection, and shall be always one of your best friends. You have but to say what you most desire, and I promise you your wish shall be granted." "Madame," replied the king, "if you are a fairy, you must know, without my telling you, the wish of my heart. I have one well-beloved son, Prince Cherry. Whatever kindly feeling you have towards me, extend it to him." "Willingly," said Candide. "I will make him the handsomest, richest, or most powerful prince in the world. Choose whichever you desire for him." "None of the 3," returned the father. "I only wish for him to be good, the best prince in the world. Of what use would riches, power, or beauty be to him if he were a bad man?" "You are right," said the fairy, "but I cannot make him good. He must do that himself. I can only change his external fortunes. For his personal character, the utmost I can promise is to give him good counsel, reprove him for his faults, and even punish him if he will not punish himself. You mortals can do the same with your children." "Ah, yes," said the king, sighing. Still he felt that the kindness of a fairy was something gained for his son, and died not long after, content and at peace. Prince Cherry mourned deeply, for he dearly loved his father, and would have gladly given all his kingdoms and treasures to keep him in life a little longer. 2 days after the good king was no more, Prince Cherry was sleeping in his chamber, when he saw the same dazzling vision of the fairy Candide. "I promised your father," said she, "to be your best friend, and in pledge of this take what I now give you." And she placed a small gold ring upon his finger. "Poor as it looks, it is more precious than diamonds, for whenever you do ill it will prick your finger. If, after that warning, you still continue in evil, you will lose my friendship, and I shall become your direst enemy." So saying, she disappeared, leaving Cherry in such amazement that he would have believed it all a dream, save for the ring on his finger. He was for a long time so good that the ring never pricked him at all, and this made him so cheerful and pleasant in his humour that everyone called him Happy Prince Cherry. But one unlucky day he was out hunting and found no sport, which vexed him so much that he showed his ill temper by his looks and his ways. He fancied his ring felt very tight and uncomfortable, but as it did not prick him, he took no heed of this, until re-entering his palace, his little pet dog, BeeBee, jumped up upon him and was sharply told to get away. The creature, accustomed to nothing but caresses, tried to attract his attention by pulling at his garments, when Prince Cherry turned and gave it a severe kick. At this moment he felt in his finger a prick like a pin. "What nonsense!" said he to himself. "The fairy must be making game of me. Why, what great evil have I done? I, the master of a great empire, cannot I kick my own dog?" A voice replied, or else Prince Cherry imagined it. No, sire, the master of a great empire has a right to do good, but not evil. I, a fairy, am as much above you as you are above your dog. I might punish you, kill you if I chose, but I prefer leaving you to amend your ways. You have been guilty of 3 faults today: bad temper, passion, cruelty. Do better tomorrow. The prince promised, and kept his word a while, but he had been brought up by a foolish nurse, who indulged him in every way, and was always telling him that he would be a king one day, when he might do as he liked in all things. He found out now that even a king cannot always do that. It vexed him and made him angry. His ring began to prick him so often that his little finger was continually bleeding. He disliked this, as was natural, and soon began to consider whether it would not be easier to throw the ring away altogether than to be constantly annoyed by it. It was such a queer thing for a king to have always a spot of blood on his finger. At last, unable to put up with it any more, he took his ring off and hid it where he would never see it, and believed himself the happiest of men, for he could now do exactly what he liked. He did it, and became every day more and more miserable. One day he saw a young girl, so beautiful that, being always accustomed to have his own way, he immediately determined to espouse her. He never doubted that she would be only too glad to be made a queen, for she was very poor. But Zelia, that was her name, answered, to his great astonishment, that she would rather not marry him. "Do I displease you?" asked the prince, into whose mind it had never entered that he could displease anybody. "Not at all, my prince," said the honest peasant maiden. "You are very handsome, very charming, but you are not like your father, the good king. I will not be your queen, for you will make me miserable." At these words the prince's love seemed all to turn to hatred. He gave orders to his guards to convey Zelia to a prison near the palace, and then took counsel with his foster brother, the one of all his ill companions who most incited him to do wrong. "Sir," said the man, "if I were in your majesty's place, I would never vex myself about a poor silly girl. Feed her on bread and water till she comes to her senses, and if she still refuses you, let her die in torment, as a warning to your other subjects should they venture to dispute your will. You will be disgraced should you suffer yourself to be conquered by a simple girl." "But," said Prince Cherry, "shall I not be disgraced if I harm a creature so perfectly innocent?" "No one is innocent who disputes your majesty's authority," said the courtier, bowing, "and it is better to commit an injustice than allow it to be supposed you can ever be contradicted with impunity." This touched Cherry on his weak point. His good impulses faded. He resolved once more to ask Zelia if she would marry him, and if she again refused, to sell her as a slave. Arrived at the cell in which she was confined, what was his astonishment to find her gone! He knew not who to accuse, for he had kept the key in his pocket the whole time. At last the foster brother suggested that the escape of Zelia might have been contrived by an old man, Solomon by name, the prince's former tutor, who was the only one who now ventured to blame him for anything that he did. Cherry sent immediately, and ordered his old friend to be brought to him, loaded heavily with irons. Then, full of fury, he went and shut himself up in his own chamber, where he went raging to and fro, till startled by a noise like a clap of thunder. The fairy Candide stood before him. "Prince," said she, in a severe voice, "I promised your father to give you good counsels, and to punish you if you refused to follow them. My counsels were forgotten, my punishments despised. Under the figure of a man, you have been no better than the beasts you chase. Like a lion in fury, a wolf in gluttony, a serpent in revenge, and a bull in brutality. Take therefore in your new form the likeness of all these animals." Scarcely had Prince Cherry heard these words than to his horror he found himself transformed into what the fairy had named. He was a creature with the head of a lion, the horns of a bull, the feet of a wolf, and the tail of a serpent. At the same time he felt himself transported to a distant forest, where, standing on the bank of a stream, he saw reflected in the water his own frightful shape, and heard a voice saying, "Look at thyself, and know thy soul has become 1,000 times uglier even than thy body." Cherry recognized the voice of Candide, and in his rage would have sprung upon her and devoured her, but he saw nothing, and the same voice said behind him, "Cease thy feeble fury, and learn to conquer thy pride by being in submission to thine own subjects." Hearing no more, he soon quitted the stream, hoping at least to get rid of the sight of himself. But he had scarcely gone 20 paces when he tumbled into a pitfall that was laid to catch bears. The bear hunters, descending from some trees hard by, caught him, chained him, and, only too delighted to get hold of such a curious-looking animal, led him along with them to the capital of his own kingdom. There great rejoicings were taking place, and the bear hunters, asking what it was all about, were told that it was because Prince Cherry, the torment of his subjects, had just been struck dead by a thunderbolt, just punishment of all his crimes. 4 courtiers, his wicked companions, had wished to divide his throne between them, but the people had risen up against them, and offered the crown to Solomon, the old tutor whom Cherry had ordered to be arrested. All this the poor monster heard. He even saw Solomon sitting upon his own throne, and trying to calm the populace by representing to them that it was not certain Prince Cherry was dead, that he might return one day to reassume with honour the crown which Solomon only consented to wear as a sort of viceroy. "I know his heart," said the honest and faithful old man. "It is tainted, but not corrupt. If alive, he may reform yet, and be all his father over again to you, his people, whom he has caused to suffer so much." These words touched the poor beast so deeply that he ceased to beat himself against the iron bars of the cage in which the hunters carried him about, became gentle as a lamb, and suffered himself to be taken quietly to a menagerie, where were kept all sorts of strange and ferocious animals, a place which he had himself often visited as a boy, but never thought he should be shut up there himself. However, he owned he had deserved it all, and began to make amends by showing himself very obedient to his keeper. This man was almost as great a brute as the animals he had charge of, and when he was in ill humour he used to beat them without rhyme or reason. One day, while he was sleeping, a tiger broke loose and leaped upon him, eager to devour him. Cherry at first felt a thrill of pleasure at the thought of being revenged. Then, seeing how helpless the man was, he wished himself free that he might defend him. Immediately the doors of his cage opened. The keeper, waking up, saw the strange beast leap out, and imagined, of course, that he was going to be slain at once. Instead, he saw the tiger lying dead, and the strange beast creeping up and laying itself at his feet to be caressed. But as he lifted up his hand to stroke it, a voice was heard saying, "Good actions never go unrewarded," and instead of the frightful monster, there crouched on the ground nothing but a pretty little dog. Cherry, delighted to find himself thus metamorphosed, caressed the keeper in every possible way, till at last the man took him up into his arms and carried him to the king, to whom he related this wonderful story from beginning to end. The queen wished to have the charming little dog, and Cherry would have been exceedingly happy could he have forgotten that he was originally a man and a king. He was lodged most elegantly, had the richest of collars to adorn his neck, and heard himself praised continually. But his beauty rather brought him into trouble, for the queen, afraid lest he might grow too large for a pet, took advice of dog doctors, who ordered that he should be fed entirely upon bread, and that very sparingly, so poor Cherry was sometimes nearly starved. One day, when they gave him his crust for breakfast, A fancy seized him to go and eat it in the palace garden. So he took the bread in his mouth and trotted away toward a stream which he knew, and where he sometimes stopped to drink. But instead of the stream he saw a splendid palace, glittering with gold and precious stones. Entering the doors was a crowd of men and women, magnificently dressed, and within there was singing and dancing and good cheer of all sorts. Yet, however grandly and gaily the people went in, Cherry noticed that those who came out were pale, thin, ragged, half naked, covered with wounds and sores. Some of them dropped dead at once, others dragged themselves on a little way and then lay down, dying of hunger, and vainly begged a morsel of bread from others who were entering in, who never took the least notice of them. Cherry perceived one woman, who was trying feebly to gather and eat some green herbs. Poor thing, he said to himself, I know what it is to be hungry, and I want my breakfast badly enough, but still it will not kill me to wait till dinner time, and my crust may save the life of this poor woman. So the little dog ran up to her and dropped his bread at her feet. She picked it up and ate it with avidity. Soon she looked quite recovered, and Cherry, delighted, was trotting back again to his kennel, when he heard loud cries and saw a young girl dragged by 4 men to the door of the palace, which they were trying to compel her to enter. Oh, how he wished himself a monster again, as when he slew the tiger, for the young girl was no other than his beloved Zelia. Alas, what could a poor little dog do to defend her? But he ran forward and barked at the men and bit their heels until at last they chased him away with heavy blows. And then he lay down outside the palace door, determined to watch and see what had become of Zelia. Conscience pricked him now. What, thought he, I am furious against these wicked men who are carrying her away, and did I not do the same myself? Did I not cast her into prison and intend to sell her as a slave? Who knows how much more wickedness I might not have done to her and others if heaven's justice had not stopped me in time? While he lay thinking and repenting, he heard a window open and saw Zelia throw out of it a bit of dainty meat. Cherry, who felt hungry enough by this time, was just about to eat it, when the woman to whom he had given his crust snatched him up in her arms. Poor little beast, cried she, patting him. Every bit of food in that palace is poisoned. You shall not touch a morsel. And at the same time the voice in the air repeated again, Good actions never go unrewarded. And Cherry found himself changed into a beautiful little white pigeon. He remembered with joy that white was the color of the fairy Candide, and began to hope that she was taking him into favor again. So he stretched his wings, delighted that he might now have a chance of approaching his fair Zelia. He flew up to the palace windows, and finding one of them open, entered and sought everywhere, but he could not find Zelia. Then, in despair, he flew out again, resolved to go over the world until he beheld her once more. He took flight at once, and traversed many countries, swiftly as a bird can, but found no trace of his beloved. At length in a desert, sitting beside an old hermit in his cave, and partaking with him his frugal repast, Cherry saw a poor peasant girl, and recognized Zelia. Transported with joy he flew in, perched on her shoulder, and expressed his delight and affection by 1,000 caresses. She, charmed with the pretty little pigeon, caressed it in her turn, and promised it that, if it would stay with her, she would love it always. What have you done, Zelia? said the hermit, smiling, and while he spoke the white pigeon vanished, and there stood Prince Cherry in his own natural form. Your enchantment ended, Prince, when Zelia promised to love you. Indeed, she has loved you always, but your many faults constrained her to hide her love. These are now amended, and you may both live happy if you will, because your union is founded upon mutual esteem. Cherry and Zelia threw themselves at the feet of the hermit, whose form also began to change. His soiled garments became of dazzling whiteness, and his long beard and withered face grew into the flowing hair and lovely countenance of the fairy Candide. Rise up, my children, said she. I must now transport you to your palace, and restore to Prince Cherry his father's crown, of which he is now worthy." She had scarcely ceased speaking when they found themselves in the chamber of Suliman, who, delighted to find again his beloved pupil and master, willingly resigned the throne, and became the most faithful of his subjects. King Cherry and Queen Zelia reigned together for many years, and it is said that the former was so blameless and strict in all his duties that though he constantly wore the ring which Candide had restored to him, it never once pricked his finger, enough to make it bleed. End of Prince Cherry, from the Fairy Book, by Miss Mulock. Read by Catherine LaVarre.
Prince Hyacinth and the Dear Little Princess, from the Blue Fairy Book by Various, and edited by Andrew Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there lived a king who was deeply in love with a princess. But she could not marry anyone because she was under an enchantment. So the king set out to seek a fairy and asked what he could do to win the princess's love. The fairy said to him, "You know that the princess has a great cat which she is very fond of. Whoever is clever enough to tread on the cat's tail is the man she is destined to marry." The king said to himself that this would not be very difficult, and he left the fairy determined to grind the cat's tail to powder rather than not tread on it at all. You may imagine that it was not long before he went to see the princess, and Puss, as usual, marched in before him, arching his back. The king took a long step and quite thought he had the tail under his foot, but the cat turned round so sharply that he only trod on air. And so it went on for 8 days, till the king began to think that this fatal tail may be full of quicksilver. It was never still for a moment. At last, however, he was lucky enough to come upon Puss fast asleep and with his tail conveniently spread out. So the king, without losing a moment, set his foot upon it heavily. With one terrific yell, the cat sprung up and instantly changed into a tall man who was fixing his angry eyes upon the king, said, "You shall marry the princess because you have been able to break the enchantment, but I will have my revenge. You shall have a son who will never be happy until he finds out that his nose is too long. And if you ever tell anyone what I have just said to you, you shall vanish away instantly, and no one shall ever see you or hear of you again." Though the king was horribly afraid of the enchanter, he could not help laughing at this threat. "If my son had such a long nose as that," he said to himself, "he must always see it or feel it, at least if he's not blind or without hands." But as the enchanter had vanished, he did not waste any more time in thinking, but went to seek the princess, who very soon consented to marry him. But after all, they had not been married very long when the king died, and the queen had nothing left to care for but her little son, who was called Hyacinth. The little prince had large blue eyes, the prettiest eyes in the world, and a sweet little mouth. But alas, his nose was so enormous that it covered half his face. The queen was inconsolable when she saw this great nose, but her ladies assured her that it was not really as large as it looked, that it was a Roman nose, and you had only to open any history to see that every hero has a large nose. The queen, who was devoted to her baby, was pleased with what they told her, and when she looked at Hyacinth again, his nose certainly did not seem to her quite so large. The prince was brought up with great care, and as soon as he could speak, they told him all sorts of dreadful stories about people who had short noses. No one was allowed to come near him whose nose did not more or less resemble his own, and the courtiers, to get favour with the queen, took to pulling their babies' noses several times every day to make them grow long. But do what they would, they were nothing by comparison with the princes. When he grew sensible, he learnt history, and whenever any great prince or beautiful princess was spoken of, his teachers took care to tell him that they had long noses. His room was hung with pictures all of people with very large noses, and the prince grew up so convinced that a long nose was a great beauty that he would not on any account have had his own a single inch shorter. When his 20th birthday was past, the queen thought it was time that he should be married. So she commanded that the portraits of several princesses should be brought for him to see, and among the others was a picture of the dear little princess. Now, she was the daughter of a great king, and would some day possess several kingdoms herself. But the Prince Hyacinth had not a thought to spare for anything of that sort. He was so much struck with her beauty. The princess, whom he thought quite charming, had, however, a little saucy nose, which in her face was the prettiest thing possible. But it was a cause of great embarrassment to the courtiers, who had got into such a habit of laughing at little noses that they sometimes found themselves laughing at hers before they had time to think. But this did not do at all before the prince, who quite failed to see the joke, and actually banished 2 of his courtiers who had dared to mention disrespectfully the dear little princess's tiny nose. The others, taking warning from this, learned to think twice before they spoke, and one even went so far as to tell the prince that, though it was quite true that no man could be worth anything unless he had a long nose, still a woman's beauty was a different thing, and he knew a learned man who understood Greek and had read in some old manuscripts that the beautiful Cleopatra herself had a tip-tilted nose. The prince made him a splendid present as a reward for this good news, and at once sent ambassadors to ask the dear little princess in marriage. The king, her father, gave his consent, and Prince Hyacinth, who, in his anxiety to see the princess, had gone 3 leagues to meet her, was just advancing to kiss her hand when, to the horror of all who stood by, the enchanter appeared as suddenly as a flash of lightning, and snatching up the dear little princess, whirled her away out of their sight. The prince was left quite unconsolable, and declared that nothing should induce him to go back to his kingdom until he had found her again, and refusing to allow any of his courtiers to follow him, he mounted his horse and rode sadly away, letting the animal choose his own path. So it happened that he came presently to a great plain, across which he rode all day long without seeing a single house, and horse and rider were terribly hungry when, as the night fell, the prince caught sight of a light which seemed to shine from a cavern. He rode up to it and saw a little old woman who appeared to be at least 100 years old. She put on her spectacles to look at Prince Hyacinth, but it was quite a long time before she could fix them securely because her nose was so very short. The prince and the fairy, for that was who she was, had no sooner looked at one another than they went into fits of laughter and cried at the same moment, "Oh, what a funny nose!" "Not so funny as your own," said Prince Hyacinth to the fairy, "but, madam, I beg you to leave the consideration of our noses such as they are, and to be good enough to give me something to eat, for I am starving, and so is my poor horse." "With all my heart," said the fairy. "Though your nose is so ridiculous, you are nevertheless the son of my best friend. I loved your father as if he had been my brother. Now he had a very handsome nose. And pray, what does mine lack?" said the prince. "Oh, it doesn't lack anything," replied the fairy. "On the contrary, there is only too much of it. But never mind, one may be a very worthy man though his nose is too long. I was telling you that I was your father's friend. He often came to see me in the old times, and you must know that I was very pretty in those days. At least, he used to say so. I should like to tell you of a conversation we had the last time I ever saw him." "Indeed," said the prince. "When I have supped, it will give me the greatest pleasure to hear it. But consider, madam, I beg of you, that I have had nothing to eat to-day." "The poor boy is right," said the fairy. "I was forgetting. Come in, then, and I will give you some supper. And while you are eating, I can tell you my story in a very few words, for I don't like endless tales myself. Too long a tongue is worse than too long a nose. And I remember when I was young that I was so much admired for not being a great chatterer. They used to tell the queen, my mother, that it was so. For though you see what I am now, I was the daughter of a great king. My father—" "Your father, I dare say, got something to eat when he was hungry," interrupted the prince. "Oh, certainly," answered the fairy. "And you also shall have supper directly. I only just wanted to tell you—" "But I really cannot listen to anything until I've had something to eat," cried the prince, who was getting quite angry. But then, remembering that he had better be polite as he much needed the fairy's help, he added, I know that in the pleasure of listening to you, I should quite forget my own hunger, but my horse, who cannot hear you, must really be fed." The fairy was very much flattered by this compliment, and said, calling to her servants, "You shall not wait another minute. You are so polite, and in spite of the enormous size of your nose, you are really very agreeable." "Plague take the old lady, how she does go on about my nose!" said the prince to himself. "One would almost think that mine had taken all the extra length that hers lacks. If I were not so hungry, I would soon have done with this chatterpie, who thinks she talks very little. How stupid people are not to see their own faults! That comes of being a princess. She has been spoiled by flatterers, who have made her believe that she is quite a moderate talker." Meanwhile, the servants were putting the supper on the table, and the prince was much amused to hear the fairy, who asked them 1,000 questions simply for the pleasure of hearing herself speak. Especially he noticed one maid who, no matter what was being said, always contrived to praise her mistress's wisdom. "Well," he thought as he ate his supper, "I'm very glad I came here. This just shows me how sensible I've been in never listening to flatterers. People of that sort praise us to our faces without shame, and hide our faults or change them into virtues. For my part, I never will be taken in by them. I know my own defects, I hope." Poor Prince Hyacinth! He really believed what he said, and hadn't an idea that the people who had praised his nose were laughing at him, just as the fairy's maid was laughing at her. For the prince had seen her laugh slyly when she could do so without the fairy's noticing her. However, he said nothing, and presently, when his hunger began to be appeased, the fairy said, "My dear prince, might I beg you to move a little more that way? For your nose casts such a shadow that I really cannot see what I have on my plate. Ah, thanks. Now let us speak of your father. When I went to his court, he was only a little boy. But that is 40 years ago, and I have been in this desolate place ever since. Tell me, what goes on nowadays? Are the ladies as fond of amusement as ever? In my time, One saw them at parties, theatres, balls, and promenades every day. Dear me, what a long nose you have! I cannot get used to it." "Really, madam," said the prince, "I wish you would leave off mentioning my nose. It cannot matter to you what it is like. I am quite satisfied with it, and have no wish to have it shorter. One must take what is given one." "Now you are angry with me, my poor Hyacinth," said the fairy, "and I assure you that I didn't mean to vex you. On the contrary, I wish to do you a service. However, though I really cannot help your nose being a shock to me, I will try not to say anything about it. I will even try to think that you have an ordinary nose. To tell the truth, it would make 3 reasonable ones." The prince, who was no longer hungry, grew so impatient at the fairy's continual remarks about his nose that at last he threw himself upon his horse and rode hastily away. But wherever he came in his journeyings, he thought the people were mad, for they all talked of his nose, and yet he could not bring himself to admit that it was too long. He had been so used all his life to hear it called handsome. The old fairy, who wished to make him happy, at last hit upon a plan. She shut the dear little princess up in a palace of crystal, and put this palace down where the prince would not fail to find it. His joy at seeing the princess again was extreme, and he set to work with all his might to try to break her prison. But in spite of all his efforts, he failed utterly. In despair, he thought at least that he would try to get near enough to speak to the dear little princess, who, on her part, stretched out her hand that he might kiss it. But turn which way he might, he never could raise it to his lips, for his long nose always prevented it. For the first time, he realized how long it really was, and exclaimed, "Well, it must be admitted that my nose is too long." In an instant the crystal prison flew into 1,000 splinters, and the old fairy, taking the dear little princess by the hand, said to the prince, "Now say if you are not very much obliged to me. Much good it was for me to talk to you about your nose. You would never have found out how extraordinary it was if it hadn't hindered you from doing what you wanted to. You see how self-love keeps us from knowing our own defects of mind and body. Our reason tries in vain to show them to us. We refuse to see them till we find them in the way of our interests." Prince Hyacinth, whose nose was now just like anyone's else, did not fail to profit by the lesson he had received. He married the dear little princess, and they lived happily ever after. End of Prince Hyacinth and the Dear Little Princess.
The Story of the Pumpkin by Norma B. Carson. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Pumpkin. Once in the summertime, there peeped out from among the tall stalks of corn a tiny vine. Little by little it grew until it bore great, rough leaves. After a short time, several thin tendrils began to make their appearance. These clung to the cornstalks and gradually worked their way over to the poles that supported the young lima bean plants. One morning, little Ellen Carter went out into the garden, and there on the pumpkin vine a wee green ball had formed. She ran in to tell her mother all about it. "Just think, mother," she exclaimed, "some day that queer-looking green thing will be a big yellow pumpkin. Do you think it will take very long for it to grow?" "Yes," replied mother, "I'm afraid that it will. You cannot count on using it very soon." So, every day, rain or shine, Ellen ran out to the garden to watch the vine. The ball was growing larger and larger each day but it was still a bright green. Ellen was a very patient little girl, yet she did find it rather hard to wait. Therefore, when in early September the pumpkin showed a faint tinge of yellow, the little girl danced with delight. At first it was only in spots that the gold appeared, but gradually it spread all over the fruit. There it lay in the midst of the green leaves, a big, round, shining yellow mass. When Ellen's father came home, the little girl greeted him at once with, "Oh, father, come look at my pumpkin. I am sure that it must be ready to pick." Mr. Carter came out, and with a sharp thrust of his penknife cut it off. "Now, little one," he smiled, "what are you going to do with it?" Ellen thought a second. Then she said, "Wouldn't it make a splendid jack-o'-lantern?" "Indeed it would," agreed her father. "Yes, and I can have a party, and mother can make us pumpkin pie from the insides." So Ellen returned to the house with the large prize in her arms and told her mother all about her plans. It was October and school had begun, but I fear that Ellen's lessons the following days were somewhat neglected. At recess she asked all her playmates to come to her house on Halloween. The next few days were busy ones. There was popcorn to pop and cakes and candy to make, for this was to be a real live party. The day before the eventual occasion, Ellen and several of her dearest friends went out into the woods to gather leaves for decorating the rooms and the table. What a host of gorgeous leaves they found, red and brown and yellow, of all shades and shapes, for it was autumn and the woods were gay with color. Then the children went to find fruit and nuts. Fall grapes were just ripe, and there were still many pears and apples, juicy and delicious. There were also some chestnuts and walnuts to be had for the picking. Oh, such a feast! That night was one of the happiest in little Ellen's experience. She and her friends had games of all kinds, fishing for apples in a dishpan, trying to catch with their teeth apples suspended on strings and swinging from the ceiling, running potato races, and having a gloriously good time together. Then at last came the good things to eat, and how good they were! There were roasted chestnuts, gingerbread, doughnuts, and all kinds of nuts, with popcorn, cider, fruit, and good old-fashioned molasses candy, to say nothing of cakes, both little and big. The room was beautiful to look upon. 20 smiling, happy children with eager, excited eyes and rosy cheeks flushing with anticipation. They ate with a will and laughed from the depths of their carefree hearts. At the very end of it all, there came a huge pumpkin pie, and then Ellen called to have the lights put out. For just a few minutes there was darkness, and then behold, 2 eyes of light, a mouth, a nose, a jack-o'-lantern came into the room, and there on a table, piled high with autumn leaves and branches, sat a squat, quaint figure, Ellen's yellow pumpkin, cut to jack-o'-lantern shape. And while Jack blinked and winked, the clock struck 12. "Time for good children to be in bed," said Mother. So the party came to an end with a glad hurrah for the yellow pumpkin and a happy Halloween. End of The Story of the Pumpkin by Norma Carson. Recording by BettyB.
Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings can be found in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Temiah Rockwell. Once there was a miller who was poor, but who had a beautiful daughter. Now it happened that he had to speak to the king, and, in order to make himself appear important, he said to him, "I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold." The king said to the miller, "That is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, and I will try what she can do." And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and reel, and said, "Now get to work. If by tomorrow morning early you have not spun this straw into gold, you must die." Thereupon he himself locked up the room and left her in it alone. So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for her life could not tell what to do. She had no idea how straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more miserable until at last she began to weep. But all at once the door opened, and in came a little man and said, "Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?" "Alas," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it." "What will you give me," said the little man, "if I do it for you?" "My necklace," said the girl. The little man took the necklace, seated himself in front of the wheel, and whir, whir, whir 3 turns, and the reel was full. Then he put another on, and whir, whir, whir 3 times around, and the second one was full too. And so it went on till the morning, when all the straw was spun, and all the reels were full of gold. By daybreak the king was there, but his heart became only more greedy. He had the miller's daughter taken into another room full of straw, which was much larger, and commanded her to spin that also in one night, if she valued her life. The girl knew not how to help herself, and was crying. When the door again opened, the little man appeared and said, "What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?" "The ring on my finger," answered the girl. The little man took the ring and began to turn the wheel, and by morning had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king rejoiced beyond measure at the sight, but still he had not gold enough. He had the miller's daughter taken into a still larger room full of straw, and said, "You must spin this too, in the course of this night, but if you succeed, you shall be my wife." "Even if she be a miller's daughter," thought he, "I could not find a richer wife in the whole world." When the girl was alone, the little man came again for the 3rd time, and said, "What will you give me if I spin the straw for you this time also?" "I have nothing left that I could give," answered the girl. "Then promise me, if you should become queen, your first child." "Who knows whether that will ever happen?" thought the miller's daughter, and, not knowing how else to help herself in this difficulty, she promised the little man what he wanted, and for that he once more span the straw into gold. And when the king came in the morning, and found all was as he wished, he took her in marriage, and the pretty miller's daughter became a queen. A year after she had a beautiful child, and she never gave thought to the little man. But suddenly he came into her room, and said, "Now give me what you promised." The queen was horror-struck, and offered the little man all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her the child. But the little man said, "No, something that is alive is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world." Then the queen began to weep and cry, so that the little man pitied her. "I will give you 3 days' time," said he. "If by that time you find out my name, then you shall keep your child." So the queen thought the whole night of all the names she had ever heard, and she sent a messenger over the country to inquire far and wide for any other names there might be. When the little man came the next day, she began with Casper, Melchior, Balthazar, and said all the names she knew one after another, but to every one the little man said, "That's not my name." On the 2nd day she had inquiries made in the neighbourhood as to the names of the people there, and she repeated to the little man the most uncommon and curious. "Perhaps your name is Shortribs, or Sheepshanks, or Laceleg." But he always answered, "That is not my name." On the 3rd day the messenger came back again and said, "I have not been able to find a single new name, but as I came to a high mountain at the end of the forest, where a fox and the hare bid each other good night, there I saw a little house. Before the house a fire was burning, and round about the fire a funny little man was jumping. He hopped upon one leg and shouted, 'Today I brew, tomorrow I bake, and next I shall the queen's child take. Ah, well, it's none knows the same that Rumpelstiltskin is my name.' You may think how glad the queen was when she heard the name, and when soon afterward the little man came in and asked, 'Now, Mistress Queen, what is my name?' She said, 'Is your name Conrad?' 'No.' 'Is your name Harry?' 'No.' 'Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin.' 'The devil has told you that! The devil devil has told you that?" cried the little man, and in his anger he stamped his right foot so deep into the earth that his whole leg went in, and then in a rage he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he tore himself in two. End of Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. Recording by Temiah Rockwell.
The Story of the Three Little Pigs. Author unknown.
This is a Librivox recording.
All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Once upon a time, there was an old sow with 3 little pigs, and as she had not enough to keep them, she sent them out to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him, "Please, man, give me that straw to build me a house," which the man did, and the little pig built a house with it. Presently came along a wolf, and knocked at the door, and said, little pig, let me in," to which the pig answered, "No, no, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in," said the wolf. So he huffed, and he puffed, and he blew his house in, and ate up the little pig. The second pig met a man with a bundle of furs, and said, "Please, man, give me that furs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in," said the wolf. So he huffed, and he puffed, and he blew his house in, and ate up the little pig. The second pig met a man with a bundle of furs, and said, "Please, man, give me that furs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll puff, and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, and at last he blew the house down, and ate up the second little pig. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks, and said, "Please, man, give me those bricks to build a house with." So the man gave him the bricks, and he built his house with them. So the wolf came, as he did to the other little pigs, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in." Well, he huffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, but he could not get the house down. When he found that he could not, with all his huffing and puffing, blow the house down, he said, little pig, I know where there's a nice field of turnips." "Where?" said the little pig. "Oh, in Mr. Smith's home field. And if you'll be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you, and we will go together and get some for dinner." "Very well," said the little pig. "I will be ready. What time do you mean to go?" "Oh, at 6 o'clock. Well, the little pig got up at 5, and got the turnips and was home before 6. When the wolf came, he said, little pig, are you ready?" "Ready," said the little pig. "I have been and come back again, and got a nice pot full for dinner." The wolf felt very angry at this, but thought that he would be up to the little pig somehow or other. So he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice apple tree." "Where?" said the pig. "Down at Merry Garden," replied the wolf. "And if you will not deceive me, I will come for you at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and we will go together and get some apples." Well, the little pig woke up at 4 the next morning, and bustled up and went off for the apples, hoping to get back before the wolf came. But he had further to go, and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was coming down from it, he saw the wolf coming, which, as you may suppose, frightened him very much. When the wolf came up, he said, little pig, what are you doing here before me? Are they nice apples?" "Yes, very," said the little pig. "I will throw you down one," as he threw it so far that, while the wolf was gone to pick it up, the little pig jumped down and ran home. The next day the wolf came again, and said to the little pig, "Little pig, there is a fair in the town this afternoon. Will you go?" "Oh, yes," said the pig. "I will go. What time shall you be ready?" "At 3, said the wolf. So the little pig went off before the time, as usual, and got to the fair, and bought a butter churn, and was on his way home with it when he saw the wolf coming. Then he could not tell what to do, so he got into the churn to hide, and in doing so turned it around, and it began to roll, and rolled down the hill with the pig inside it, which frightened the wolf so much that he ran home without going to the fair. He went to the little pig's house, and told him how frightened he had been by a great round thing which came down the hill past him. Then the little pig said, "Ha! I frightened you, did I? I had been to the fair and bought a butter churn, and when I saw you I got into it and rolled down the hill." Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared he would eat up the little pig, and that he would get down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung on the pot full of water and made up a blazing fire, and just as the wolf was coming down, took off the cover of the pot, and in fell the wolf. And the little pig put on the cover again in an instant, boiled him up, and ate him for supper, and lived happy ever after.
End of
The Story of the Three Little Pigs. Author unknown.
The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was dreadfully cold. It was snowing fast and was almost dark as evening came on, the last evening of the year. In the cold and the darkness, there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded and with naked feet. When she left home, she had slippers on, it is true, but they were much too large for her feet, slippers that her mother had used till then, and the poor little girl lost them in running across the street when two carriages were passing terribly fast. When she looked for them, one of them was not to be found, and a boy seized the other, ran away with it, saying he would use it for a cradle some day, when he had children of his own. So on the little girl went with her bare feet that were red and blue with gold. In an old apron that she wore were bundles of matches, and she carried a bundle also in her hand. No one had bought so much as a bunch all the long day, and no one had given her even a penny. Poor little girl, shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along, a perfect picture of misery. The snowflakes fell on her long flaxen hair, which hung in pretty curls about her throat. But she thought not of her beauty, nor of the cold. Lights gleamed in every window, and there came to her the savory smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve, and it was this of which she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, one of which projected beyond the other, she sat cowering down. She had drawn under her little feet, but still she grew colder and colder. Yet she dared not go home, for she had sold no matches and could not bring a penny of money. Her father would certainly beat her, and besides, it was cold enough at home, for they had only the house roof above them. And though the largest holes had been stopped with straw and rags, there were left many through which the cold wind could whistle. And now her little hands were nearly frozen with cold. Alas, a single match might do her good, if she might only draw it from the bundle, rub it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. So at last she drew one out. Whoosh! How it blazed and burned! It gave out a warm, bright flame like a little candle as she held her hands over it. A wonderful little light it was. It really seemed to the girl as if she sat before a great iron stove with polished brass feet and brass shovel and tongs. So blessedly it burned that the little maiden stretched out her feet to warm them also. How comfortable she was! But lo, the flame went out. The stove vanished, and nothing remained but the little burnt match in her hand. She rubbed another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell upon the wall, it became transparent like a veil, so that she could see through it into the room. A snow-white cloth was spread upon the table, on which was a beautiful china dinner service, while a roast goose, stuffed with apples and prunes, steamed famously and sent forth a most savoury smell. And what was more delightful still, and wonderful, the goose jumped from the dish, with knife and fork still in its breast, and waddled along the floor straight to the little girl. But the match went out then, and nothing was left to her but a thick, damp wall. She lighted another match, and now she was under the most beautiful Christmas tree, larger and far more prettily trimmed than the one she had seen through the glass doors at the rich merchant's. Hundreds of wax tapers were burning on the green branches, and gay figures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The child stretched out her hands to them. Then the match went out. Still the light of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven, and one of them fell, forming a long trail of fire. "Now someone is dying," murmured the child softly, for her grandmother, the only person who had loved her and who was now dead, had told her that whenever a star falls, a soul mounts up to God. She struck yet another match against the wall, and again it was light, and in the brightness there appeared before her the dear old grandmother, bright and radiant, yet sweet and mild, and happy as she had never looked on earth. "Oh, grandmother," cried the child, "take me with you. I know you'll go away when the match burns out. You too will vanish, like warm stove, the splendid New Year's feast, and the beautiful Christmas tree." And lest her grandmother should disappear, she rubbed the whole bundle of matches against the wall. And the matches burned with such a brilliant light that it became brighter than the noonday. Her grandmother had never looked so grand and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and both flew together, joyously and gloriously, mounting higher and higher, far above the earth, and for them there was neither hunger, nor cold, nor care. They were with God. But in the corner, at the dawn of day, sat the poor girl, leaning against the wall, with red cheeks and smiling mouth, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and cold she sat, with the matches, one bundle of which was burnt. She wanted to warm herself. Poor little thing, people said. No one imagined what sweet visions she had had, or how gloriously she had gone with her grandmother to enter upon the joys of a new year. End of The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi.
The Mandarin and the Butterfly by L. Frank Baum. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Mandarin once lived in Kiango, who was so exceedingly cross and disagreeable that everyone hated him. He snarled and stormed at every person he met, and was never known to laugh or be merry under any circumstances. Especially he hated boys and girls, for the boys jeered at him, which aroused his wrath, and girls made fun of him, which hurt his pride. When he had become so unpopular that no one would speak to him, the emperor heard about it and commanded him to emigrate to America. This suited the Mandarin very well, but before he left China, he stole the great book of magic that belonged to the wise magician Huatsai. Then, gathering up his little store of money, he took ship for America. He settled in a city of the Middle West and, of course, started a laundry, since that seems to be the natural vocation of every Chinaman, be he coolie or Mandarin. He made no acquaintances with the other Chinamen of the town, who, when they met him and saw the red button in his hat, knew him for a real Mandarin, and bowed low before him. He put up a red and white sign, and the people brought their laundry to him, and got paper checks, with Chinese characters on them, in exchange. This being the only sort of character the Mandarin had left. One day, as the ugly one was ironing in his shop in the basement of 263½ Main Street, he looked up and saw a crowd of childish faces pressing against the window. Most Chinamen make friends with children. This one hated them and tried to drive them away. But as soon as he returned to his work, they were back at the window again, mischievously smiling down at him. The naughty Mandarin uttered horrid words in the Manchu language and made fierce gestures, but this did no good at all. The children stayed as long as they pleased, and they came again the very next day as soon as the school was over, and likewise the next day and the next, for they saw their presence at the window bothered the Chinamen and were delighted accordingly. The following day, being Sunday, the children did not appear. But as the Mandarin, being a heathen, worked in his shop, a big butterfly flew in at the open door and fluttered around the room. The Mandarin closed the door and chased the butterfly until he caught it, when he pinned it against the wall by sticking 2 pins through its beautiful wings. This did not hurt the butterfly, there being no feeling in its wings, but it made him a safe prisoner. This butterfly was of large size, and its wings were exquisitely marked by gorgeous colors, laid out in regular designs like stained glass windows of a cathedral. The Mandarin now opened his wooden chest and drew forth the great book of magic he had stolen from Huatsai. Turning the pages slowly, he came to a passage describing how to understand the language of butterflies. This he read carefully and then mixed a magic formula in a tin cup and drank it down with a wry face. Immediately thereafter he spoke to the butterfly in its own language, saying, "Why did you enter this room?" "I smelled beeswax," answered the butterfly. "Therefore I thought I might find honey here." "But you are my prisoner," said the Mandarin. "If I please, I can kill you or leave you on the wall to starve to death." "I expect that," replied the butterfly with a sigh. "But my race is short-lived anyway. It doesn't matter whether death comes sooner or later." "Yet you like to live, do you not?" asked the Mandarin. "Yet life is pleasant and the world is beautiful. I do not seek death." "Then," said the Mandarin, "I will give you life, a long and pleasant life, if you will promise to obey me for a time and carry out my instructions." "How can a butterfly serve a man?" asked the creature in surprise. "Usually they cannot," was the reply, "but I have a book of magic which teaches me strange things. Do you promise?" "Oh yes, I promise," answered the butterfly. For even as your slave, I will get some enjoyment out of life, while should you kill me, that is the end of everything." "Truly," said the Mandarin, "butterflies have no souls, and therefore cannot live again." "But I have enjoyed 3 lives already," replied the butterfly with some pride. "I have been a caterpillar and a chrysalis before I became a butterfly. You were never anything but a Chinaman, although I admit your life is longer than mine." "I will extend your life for many days if you obey me," declared the Chinaman. "I can easily do so by means of magic." "Of course I will obey you," said the butterfly carelessly. "Then listen. You know children, do you not? Boys and girls?" "Yes, I know them. They chase me and try to catch me, as you have done," replied the butterfly. "And they mock me and jeer at me through the window," continued the Mandarin bitterly. "Therefore they are your enemies and mine. But with your aid and the help of the magic book, we shall find revenge for their insults." "I don't care much for revenge," said the butterfly. "They are but children, and it is natural they should wish to catch such a beautiful creature as I am." "Nevertheless, I care, and you must obey me," retorted the Mandarin harshly. "I, at least, will have my revenge." Then he stuck a drop of molasses upon the wall beside the butterfly's head and said, "Eat that while I read my book and prepare my magic formula." So the butterfly feasted upon the molasses, and the Mandarin studied his book, after which he began to mix a magic compound in the tin cup. When the mixture was ready, he released the butterfly from the wall and said to it, "I command you to dip your 2 front feet into this magic compound and then fly away until you meet a child. Fly close, whether it be a boy or a girl, and touch the child upon its forehead with your feet. Whoever is thus touched, the book declares, will at once become a pig, and will remain such forever after. Then return to me and dip your legs afresh in the contents of this cup. So shall all my enemies, the children, become miserable swine, while no one will think of accusing me of sorcery." "Very well. Since such is your command, I obey," said the butterfly. Then it dipped its front legs, which were the shortest of the 6, into the contents of the tin cup, and flew out of the door and away over the houses to the edge of the town. There it alighted in a flower garden and soon forgot all about its mission to turn children into swine. In going from flower to flower, it soon brushed the magic compound from its legs, so that when the sun began to set, the butterfly finally remembered its master, the Mandarin. It could have not injured a child had it tried, but it did not intend to try. "That horrid old Chinaman," it thought, "hates children and wishes to destroy them, but I rather like children myself and shall not harm them. Of course I must return to my master, for he is a magician, and would seek me out and kill me, but I can deceive him about this matter easily enough." When the butterfly flew in the door of the Mandarin's laundry, he asked eagerly, "Well, did you meet a child?" "I did," replied the butterfly calmly. "It was a pretty golden-haired girl, but now it is a grunting pig." "Good, good, good," cried the Mandarin, dancing joyfully about the room. "You shall have molasses for your supper, and tomorrow you must change 2 children into small pigs." The butterfly did not reply, and ate the molasses in silence. Having no soul, it had no conscience, and having no conscience, it was able to lie to the Mandarin with great readiness and a certain amount of enjoyment. Next morning, by the Mandarin's command, the butterfly dipped its legs in the mixture and flew away in search of children. When it came to the edge of the town, it noticed a pig in a sty, and alighted upon the rail of the sty. It looked down at the creature and thought, "If I could change a child into a pig by touching it with magic compound, what could I change a pig into, I wonder?" Being curious to determine this fine point of sorcery, the butterfly fluttered down and touched its front feet to the pig's nose. Instantly, the animal disappeared, and in its place was a shock-headed, dirty-looking boy, which sprang from the sty and ran down the road, uttering loud whoops. "That's funny," said the butterfly to itself. "The Mandarin would be very angry with me if he knew of this, for I have liberated one more of the creatures that bother him." It fluttered along after the boy, who had paused to throw stones at a cat, but Pussy escaped by running up a tree, where thick branches protected her from the stones. Then the boy discovered a newly planted garden and trampled upon the beds until the seeds were scattered far and wide, and the garden was ruined. Next he caught up a switch and struck with it a young calf that stood quietly grazing in a field. The poor creature ran away with piteous bleats, and the boy laughed and followed after it, striking the frightened animal again and again. "Really," thought the butterfly, "I do not wonder the Mandarin hates children, if they were all so cruel and wicked as this one." The calf, having escaped him, the boy, came back to the road, where he met two little girls on their way to school. One of them had a red apple in her hand, and the boy snatched it away and began eating it. The little girl commenced to cry, but her companion, more brave and sturdy, cried out, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, you nasty boy." At this, the boy reached out and slapped her pretty face, whereupon she also began to sob. Although possessed of neither soul nor conscience, the butterfly had a very tender heart, and now decided it can endure this boy no longer. "If I permitted him to exist," it reflected, "I should never forgive myself, for the monster would do nothing but evil from morning till night." So it flew directly into his face and touched his forehead with its sticky front feet. The next instant the boy had disappeared, but a grunting pig ran swiftly up the road in the direction of its sty. The butterfly gave a sigh of relief. "This time I have indeed used the Mandarin's magic upon a child," it whispered as it floated lazily upon the light breeze. "But since the child was originally a pig, I do not think I have any cause to reproach myself. The little girls were sweet and gentle, and I would not injure them to save my life. But were all the boys like this transformed pig, I should not hesitate to carry out the Mandarin's orders." Then it flew into a rose bush, where it remained comfortably until evening. At sundown, it returned to its master. "Have you changed two of them into pigs?" he asked at once. "I have," replied the butterfly. "One was a pretty black-eyed baby, and the other was a freckled-faced, red-haired, barefoot new boy." "Good, good, good," screamed the Mandarin in an ecstasy of delight. "Those are the ones who torment me the most. Change every new boy you meet into a pig." "Very well," answered the butterfly quietly, and ate its supper of molasses. Several days were passed by the butterfly in the same manner. It fluttered aimlessly around the flower gardens while the sun shone, and returned at night to the Mandarin with false tales of turning children into swine. Sometimes it would be one child which was transformed, sometimes two, and occasionally three. But the Mandarin always greeted the butterfly's report with intense delight and gave him molasses for supper. One evening, however, the butterfly thought it might be well to vary the report, so that the Mandarin might not grow suspicious. And when the master asked what child had been changed into a pig that day, the lying creature answered, "It was a Chinese boy, and when I touched him, he became a black pig." This angered the Mandarin, who was in a specially cross mood. He spitefully snapped the butterfly with his finger and nearly broke its beautiful wing, for he had forgot that Chinese boys had once mocked him and only remembered his hatred for American boys. The butterfly became very indignant at this abuse from the Mandarin. It refused to eat its molasses and sulked all evening, for it had grown to hate the Mandarin almost as much as the Mandarin hated children. When morning came, it was still trembling with indignation. But the Mandarin cried out, "Make haste, miserable slave, for today you must change 4 children into pigs to make up for yesterday." The butterfly did not reply. His little black eyes were sparkling wickedly, and no sooner had he dipped his feet into the magic compound than he flew full in the Mandarin's face and touched him upon his ugly, flat forehead. Soon after, a gentleman came into the room for his laundry. The Mandarin was not there, but running around the place was a repulsive, scrawny pig, which squealed most miserably. The butterfly flew away to a brook and washed from its feet all traces of the magic compound. When night came, it slept in a rose bush. The Mandarin and the Butterfly by L. Frank Baum. Read by Max Hollway.
The Real Princess by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There was once a prince who wished to marry a princess, but then she must be a real princess. He traveled all over the world in hopes of finding such a lady, but there was always something wrong. Princesses he found in plenty, but whether they were real princesses it was impossible for him to decide, for now one thing, now another, seemed to him not quite right about the ladies. At last he returned to his palace quite cast down, because he wished so much to have a real princess for his wife. One evening a fearful tempest arose. It thundered and lightened, and the rain poured down from the sky in torrents. Besides, it was as dark as pitch. All at once there was heard a violent knocking at the door, and the old king, the prince's father, went out himself to open it. It was a princess who was standing outside the door. What with the rain and the wind, she was in a sad condition. The water trickled down from her hair, and her clothes clung to her body. She said she was a real princess. "Ah, we shall soon see that," thought the queen mother. However, she said not a word of what she was going to do, but went quietly into the bedroom, took all the bedclothes off the bed, and put 3 little peas on the bedstead. She then laid 20 mattresses, one upon the other, over the 3 peas, and put 20 feather beds over the mattresses. Upon this bed the princess was to pass the night. The next morning she was asked how she had slept. "Oh, very badly indeed," she replied. "I have scarcely closed my eyes the whole night through. I did not know what was in my bed, but I had something hard under me, and am all over black and blue. It has hurt me so much." Now it was plain that the lady must be a real princess, since she had been able to feel the 3 little peas through the 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds. None but a real princess could have had such a delicate sense of feeling. The prince accordingly made her his wife, being now convinced that he had found a real princess. The 3 peas were, however, put into the cabinet of curiosities, where they are still to be seen, provided they are not lost. Wasn't this a lady of real delicacy? End of The Real Princess by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Suzabelle.
The 12 Dancing Princesses, edited by Andrew Lang. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 12 Dancing Princesses. Once upon a time there lived in the village of Montigny-sur-Roc a little cowboy without either father or mother. His real name was Michael, but he was always called the Stargazer, because when he drove his cows over the commons to seek for pasture, he went along with his head in the air, gaping at nothing. As he had a white skin, blue eyes, and hair that curled all over his head, the village girls used to cry after him, "Well, Stargazer, what are you doing?" And Michael would answer, "Oh, nothing," and go on his way without even turning to look at them. The fact was, he thought them very ugly, with their sunburnt necks, their great red hands, their coarse petticoats, and their wooden shoes. He had heard that somewhere in the world there were girls whose necks were white and whose hands were small, who were always dressed in the finest silks and laces, and were called princesses, and while his companions round the fire saw nothing in the flames but common everyday fancies, he dreamed that he had the happiness to marry a princess. One morning about the middle of August, just at midday when the sun was hottest, Michael ate his dinner of a piece of dry bread and went to sleep under an oak. And while he slept, he dreamt that there appeared before him a beautiful lady dressed in a robe of cloth of gold, who said to him, "Go to the castle of Belle-Isle, and there you shall marry a princess." That evening the little cowboy, who had been thinking a great deal about the advice of the lady in the golden dress, told his dream to the farm people. But, as was natural, they only laughed at the stargazer. The next day at the same hour he went to sleep again under the same tree. The lady appeared to him a second time and said, "Go to the castle of Belle-Isle, and you shall marry a princess." In the evening Michael told his friends that he had dreamed the same dream again, but they only laughed at him more than before. "Never mind," he thought to himself. "If the lady appears to me a third time, I will do as she tells me." The following day, to the great astonishment of all the village, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon a voice was heard singing, "Rally-o, rally-o, how the cattle go." It was the little cowboy driving his herd back to the byre. The farmer began to scold him furiously, but he answered quietly, "I am going away," made his clothes into a bundle, said goodbye to all his friends, and boldly set out to seek his fortune. There was great excitement through all the village, and on the top of the hill the people stood holding their sides with laughing, as they watched the stargazer trudging bravely along the valley with his bundle at the end of his stick. It was enough to make anyone laugh, certainly. It was well known for full 20 miles round that there lived in the castle of Belle-Isle 12 princesses of wonderful beauty, and as proud as they were beautiful, and who were besides so very sensitive and of such truly royal blood that they would have felt at once the presence of a pea in their beds, even if the mattresses had been laid over it. It was whispered about that they led exactly the lives that princesses ought to lead, sleeping far into the morning and never getting up till midday. They had 12 beds, all in the same room, but what was very extraordinary was the fact that though they were locked in by triple bolts, every morning their satin shoes were found worn into holes. When they were asked what they had been doing all night, they always answered that they had been asleep, and, indeed, no noise was ever heard in the room, yet the shoes could not wear themselves out alone. At last the Duke of Belle-Isle ordered the trumpet to be sounded, and a proclamation to be made that whoever could discover how his daughters wore out their shoes should choose one of them for his wife. On hearing the proclamation, a number of princes arrived at the castle to try their luck. They watched all night behind the open door of the princesses, but when the morning came, they had all disappeared, and no one could tell what had become of them. 4. When he reached the castle, Michael went straight to the gardener and offered his services. Now it happened that the garden boy had just been sent away, and though the stargazer did not look very sturdy, the gardener agreed to take him, as he thought that his pretty face and golden curls would please the princesses. The first thing he was told that when the princesses got up, he was to present each one with a bouquet, and Michael thought that if he had nothing more unpleasant to do than that, he should get on very well. Accordingly, he placed himself behind the door of the princess's room with the 12 bouquets in a basket. He gave one to each of the sisters, and they took them without even deigning to look at the lad, except Lena, the youngest, who fixed her large black eyes as soft as velvet on him, and exclaimed, "Oh, how pretty he is, our new flower boy!" The rest all burst out laughing, and the eldest pointed out that a princess ought never to lower herself by looking at a garden boy. Now Michael knew quite well what had happened to all the princes, but notwithstanding, the beautiful eyes of the Princess Lena inspired him with a violent longing to try his fate. Unhappily, he did not dare to come forward, being afraid that he should only be jeered at, or even turned away from the castle on account of his impudence. 5. Nevertheless, the stargazer had another dream. The lady in the golden dress appeared to him once more, holding in one hand 2 young laurel trees, a cherry laurel and a rose laurel, and in the other hand a little golden rake, a little golden bucket, and a silken towel. She thus addressed him. "Plant these 2 laurels in 2 large pots, rake them over with the rake, water them with the bucket, and wipe them with the towel. When they have grown as tall as a girl of 15, say to each of them, 'My beautiful laurel, with the golden rake I have raked you, with the golden bucket I have watered you, with the silken towel I have wiped you.' Then after that ask anything you choose, and the laurels will give it to you." Michael thanked the lady in the golden dress, and when he woke he found the 2 laurel bushes beside him. so he carefully obeyed the orders he had been given by the lady. The trees grew very fast, and when they were as tall as a girl of 15, he said to the cherry laurel, "My lovely cherry laurel, with the golden rake I have raked thee, with the golden bucket I have watered thee, with the silken towel I have wiped thee. Teach me how to become invisible." Then there instantly appeared on the laurel a pretty white flower, which Michael gathered and stuck into his buttonhole. 6. That evening, when the princesses went upstairs to bed, he followed them barefoot, so that he might make no noise, and hid himself under one of the 12 beds, so as not to take up much room. The princesses began at once to open their wardrobes and boxes. They took out of them the most magnificent dresses, which they put on before their mirrors, and when they had finished turned themselves all round to admire their appearances. Michael could see nothing from his hiding place, but he could hear everything, and he listened to the princesses laughing and jumping with pleasure. At last the eldest said, "Be quick, my sisters, our partners will be impatient." At the end of an hour, when the stargazer heard no more noise, he peeped out and saw the 12 sisters in splendid garments, with their satin shoes on their feet, and in their hands the bouquets he had brought them. "Are you ready?" asked the eldest. "Yes," replied the other 11 in chorus, and they took their places one by one behind her. Then the eldest princess clapped her hands 3 times, and a trap-door opened. All the princesses disappeared down a secret staircase, and Michael hastily followed them. As he was following on the steps of the Princess Lena, he carelessly trod on her dress. "There is somebody behind me!" cried the princess. "They are holding my dress!" "You foolish thing!" said her eldest sister. "You are always afraid of something. It is only a nail which caught you." 7. They went down, 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 till at last they came to a passage with a door at one end, which was only fastened with a latch. The eldest princess opened it, and they found themselves immediately in a lovely little wood, where the leaves were spangled with drops of silver which shone in the brilliant light of the moon. They next crossed another wood where the leaves were sprinkled with gold, and after that another still, where the leaves glittered with diamonds. At last the stargazer perceived a large lake, and on the shores of the lake 12 little boats with awnings, in which were seated 12 princes, who, grasping their oars, awaited the princesses. Each princess entered one of the boats, and Michael slipped into that which held the youngest. The boats glided along rapidly, but Lena's, from being heavier, was always behind the rest. "We never went so slowly before," said the princess. "What can be the reason?" "I don't know," answered the prince. "I assure you I am rowing as hard as I can." On the other side of the lake the garden boys saw a beautiful castle, splendidly illuminated, whence came the lively music of fiddles, kettle-drums, and trumpets. In a moment they touched land, and the company jumped out of the boats, and the princes, after having securely fastened their barks, gave their arms to the princesses and conducted them to the castle. 8. Michael followed and entered the ballroom in their train. Everywhere were mirrors, lights, flowers, and damask hangings. The stargazer was quite bewildered at the magnificence of the sight. He placed himself out of the way in a corner, admiring the grace and beauty of the princesses. Their loveliness was of every kind. Some were fair and some were dark, some had chestnut hair, or curls darker still, and some had golden locks. Never were so many beautiful princesses seen together at one time, but the one whom the cowboy thought the most beautiful and the most fascinating was the little princess with the velvet eyes. With what eagerness she danced! Leaning on her partner's shoulder, she swept by like a whirlwind. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkled, and it was plain that she loved dancing better than anything else. The poor boy envied those handsome young men with whom she danced so gracefully, but he did not know how little reason he had to be jealous of them. The young men were really the princes, who, to the number of 50 at least, had tried to steal the princess's secret. The princesses had made them drink something of a philtre, which froze the heart and left nothing but the love of dancing. 9. They danced on till the shoes of the princesses were worn into holes. When the cock crowed the 3rd time, the fiddle stopped, and a delicious supper was served by negro boys, consisting of sugared orange flowers, crystallized rose leaves, powdered violets, cracknels, wafers, and other dishes, which are, as everyone knows, the favorite food of princesses. After supper, the dancers all went back to their boats, and this time the stargazer entered that of the eldest princess. They crossed again the wood with the diamond-spangled leaves, the wood with the gold-sprinkled leaves, and the wood whose leaves glittered with drops of silver, and as a proof of what he had seen, the boy broke a small branch from a tree in the last wood. Lena turned as she heard the noise made by the breaking of the branch. "What was that noise?" she said. "It was nothing," replied her eldest sister. "It was only the screech of the barn owl that roosts in one of the turrets of the castle." While she was speaking, Michael managed to slip in front, and running up the staircase, he reached the princess's room first. He flung open the window, and sliding down the vine which climbed up the wall, found himself in the garden just as the sun was beginning to rise, and it was time for him to set to his work. 10. That day, when he made up the bouquets, Michael hid the branch with the silver drops in the nosegay intended for the youngest princess. When Lena discovered it, she was much surprised. However, she said nothing to her sisters, but as she met the boy by accident while she was walking under the shade of the elms, she suddenly stopped as if to speak to him, then, altering her mind, went on her way. The same evening the 12 sisters went again to the ball, and the stargazer again followed them and crossed the lake in Lena's boat. This time it was the prince who complained that the boat seemed very heavy.
"It is the heat," replied the princess. "I too have been feeling very warm."
During the ball she looked everywhere for the gardener's boy, but she never saw him. As they came back, Michael gathered a branch from the wood with the gold-spangled leaves, and now it was the eldest princess who heard the noise that it made in breaking.
"It is nothing," said Lena, "only the cry of the owl which roosts in the turrets of the castle."
As soon as she got up, she found the branch in her bouquet. When the sisters went down, she stayed a little behind and said to the cowboy,
"Where does this branch come from?"
"Your Royal Highness knows well enough," answered Michael.
"So you have followed us?"
"Yes, princess."
"How did you manage it? We never saw you."
"I hid myself," replied the stargazer quietly. The princess was silent a moment and then said,
"You know our secret. Keep it. Here is the reward of your discretion."
And she flung the boy a purse of gold. "I do not sell my silence," answered Michael, and he went away without picking up the purse. For 3 nights Lena neither saw nor heard anything extraordinary. On the 4th she heard a rustling among the diamond-spangled leaves of the wood. That day there was a branch of the trees in her bouquet. She took the stargazer aside and said to him in a harsh voice,
"You know what price my father has promised to pay for our secret?"
"I know, princess," answered Michael.
"Don't you mean to tell him?"
"That is not my intention."
"Are you afraid?"
"No, princess."
"What makes you so discreet, then?"
But Michael was silent. 11. Lena's sisters had seen her talking to the little garden boy and jeered at her for it.
"What prevents your marrying him?" asked the eldest. "You would become a gardener too. It is a charming profession. You could live in a cottage at the end of the park and help your husband to draw up water from the well, and when we get up you could bring us our bouquets."
The Princess Lena was very angry, and when the stargazer presented her bouquet, she received it in a disdainful manner. Michael behaved most respectfully. He never raised his eyes to her, but nearly all day she felt him at her side without ever seeing him. One day she made up her mind to tell everything to her eldest sister.
"What?" said she. "This rogue knows our secret, and you never told me? I must lose no time in getting rid of him." "But how?" "Why, by having him taken to the tower with the dungeons, of course."
For this was the way that in old times beautiful princesses got rid of people who knew too much. But the astonishing part of it was that the youngest sister did not seem at all to relish this method of stopping the mouth of the gardener's boy, who, after all, had said nothing to their father. It was agreed that the question should be submitted to the other 10 sisters. All were on the side of the eldest. Then the youngest sister declared that if they laid a finger on the little garden boy, she would herself go and tell their father the secret of the holes in their shoes. At last it was decided that Michael should be put to the test, that they would take him to the ball, and at the end of supper would give him the philtre which was to enchant him like the rest. They sent for the stargazer and asked him how he had contrived to learn their secret, but still he remained silent. Then in commanding tones the eldest sister gave him the order they had agreed upon. He only answered, "I will obey." He had really been present, invisible, at the council of princesses, and had heard all, but he had to make up his mind to drink of the philtre and sacrifice himself to the happiness of her he loved. Not wishing, however, to cut a poor figure at the ball by the side of the other dancers, he went at once to the laurels and said, "My lovely rose laurel, with the golden rake I have raked thee, with the golden bucket I have watered thee, with a silken towel I have dried thee. Dress me like a prince." A beautiful pink flower appeared. Michael gathered it, and found himself in a moment clothed in velvet, which was as black as the eyes of the little princess, with a cap to match, a diamond aigrette, and a blossom of the rose laurel in his buttonhole. Thus dressed, he presented himself that evening before the Duke of Beloeil, and obtained leave to try and discover his daughter's secret. He looked so distinguished that hardly anyone would have known who he was. 14. The 12 princesses went upstairs to bed. Michael followed them, and waited behind the open door till they gave the signal for departure. This time he did not cross in Lena's boat. He gave his arm to the eldest sister, danced with each in turn, and was so graceful that everyone was delighted with him. At last the time came for him to dance with the little princess. She found him the best partner in the world, but he did not dare to speak a single word to her. When he was taking her back to her place, she said to him in a mocking voice, "Here you are at the summit of your wishes. You are being treated like a prince." "Don't be afraid," replied the stargazer gently. "You shall never be a gardener's wife." The little princess stared at him with a frightened face, and he left her without waiting for an answer. When the satin slippers were worn through, the fiddle stopped, and the nigger boys set the table. Michael was placed next to the eldest sister, and opposite to the youngest. They gave him the most exquisite dishes to eat, and the most delicate wines to drink, and in order to turn his head more completely, compliments and flattery were heaped on him from every side. But he took care not to be intoxicated, either by the wine or the compliments. 15. At last the eldest sister made a sign, and one of the black pages brought in a large golden cup. "The enchanted castle has no more secrets for you," she said to the stargazer. "Let us drink to your triumph." He cast a lingering glance at the little princess, and without hesitation lifted the cup. "Don't drink!" suddenly cried out the little princess. "I would rather marry a gardener!" And she burst into tears. Michael flung the contents of the cup behind him, sprang over the table, and fell at Lena's feet. The rest of the princes fell likewise at the knees of the princesses, each of whom chose a husband and raised him to her side. The charm was broken. The 12 couples embarked in the boats, which crossed back many times in order to carry over the other princes. Then they all went through the 3 woods, and when they had passed the door of the underground passage, a great noise was heard, as if the enchanted castle was crumbling to the earth. They went straight to the room of the Duke of Beloeil, who had just awoke. Michael held in his hand the golden cup, and he revealed the secret of the holes in the shoes. "Choose then," said the Duke, "whichever you prefer." "My choice is already made," replied the garden boy, and he offered his hand to the youngest princess, who blushed and lowered her eyes. 16. The Princess Lena did not become a gardener's wife. On the contrary, it was the stargazer who became a prince. But before the marriage ceremony, the princess insisted that her lover should tell her how he came to discover the secret. So he showed her the 2 laurels which had helped him, and she, like a prudent girl, thinking they gave him too much advantage over his wife, cut them off at the root and threw them in the fire. And this is why the country girls go about singing, "Nous n'irons plus au bois, les lauriers sont coupés," and dancing in summer by the light of the moon. End of The 12 Dancing Princesses.
The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. It was so beautiful in the country. It was the summertime. The wheat fields were golden, the oats were green, and the hay stood in great stacks in the green meadows. The stork paraded about among them on his long red legs, chattering away in Egyptian, the language he had learned from his lady mother. All around the meadows and cornfields grew thick woods, and in the midst of the forest was a deep lake. Yes, it was beautiful. It was delightful in the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse, circled all about with deep canals, and from the walls down to the water's edge grew great burdocks, so high that under the tallest of them a little child might stand upright. The spot was wild, as if it had been in the very center of the thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck upon her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. But the pleasure she had felt at first was almost gone. She had begun to think of it as a wearisome task, for the little ones were so long coming out of their shells, and she seldom had visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the canals than to climb the slippery banks and sit under the burdock leaves to have a gossip with her. It was a long time to stay so much by herself. At length, however, one shell cracked, and soon another, and from each came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Peep, peep." "Quack, quack," said the mother, and then they all tried to say it too, as well as they could, while they looked all about them on every side at the tall green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look about as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "What a great world it is, to be sure," said the little ones, when they found out how much more room they had than when they were in the eggshell. "Is this all the world, do you imagine?" said the mother. "Wait till you see the garden. Far beyond it stretches down to the pastor's field, though I have never ventured to such a distance. And you all out? No, not all. The largest egg lies there yet, I declare. I wonder how long before this business is to last. I'm really beginning to be tired of it." But for all that, she sat down again. "Well, and how are you today?" quacked an old duck who came to pay her a visit. "There's one egg that takes a deal of hatching. The shell is hard and will not break," said the fond mother, who sat still upon her nest. "But just look at the others. Have I not a pretty family? Are they not the prettiest little ducklings you ever saw? They are the image of their father, the good-for-naught. He never comes to see me." "Let me see the egg that will not break," said the old duck. "I've no doubt it's a guinea fowl's egg. The same thing happened to me once, and a deal of trouble it gave me, for the young ones are afraid of the water. I quacked and clucked, but all to no purpose. Let me take a look at it. Yes, I'm right. It's a guinea fowl, upon my word. So take my advice and leave it where it is. Come to the water and teach the other children to swim." "I think I will sit a little while longer," said the mother. "I have sat so long. A day or two won't matter." "Very well. Please yourself," said the old duck, rising, and she went away. At last the great egg broke, and the latest bird cried "Peep, peep," as he crept forth from the shell. How big and ugly he was! The mother duck stared at him and did not know what to think. "Really," she said, "this is an enormous duckling, and it is not at all like the others. I wonder if he will turn out to be a guinea fowl. Well, we shall see when we get to the water, for into the water he must go, even if I have to push him myself." On the next day the weather was delightful. The sun shone brightly on the green burdock leaves, and the mother took her whole family down to the water and jumped in with a splash. "Quack, quack," cried she, and one after another the little ducklings jumped in. The water closed over their head, but they came up again in an instant and swam about quite prettily, their legs paddling under them as easily as possible. Their legs went of their own accord. And the ugly grey-coat was also in the water, swimming with them. "Oh," said the mother, "that is not a guinea fowl. See how well he uses his legs, and how erect he holds himself. He is my own child. He's not so very ugly after all, if you look at him properly. Quack, quack. Come with me now. I will take you into grand society and introduce you to the farmyard. But you must keep close to me, or you may be trodden upon, and above all, beware of the cat." When they reached the farmyard, there was a wretched riot going on. 2 families were fighting for an eel's head, which, after all, was carried off by the cat. "See, children, that is the way of the world," said the mother duck, whetting her beak, for she would have liked the eel's head herself. "Come now, use your legs, and let me see how well you can behave. You must bow your heads prettily to that old duck yonder. She is the highest born of them all, and has Spanish blood. Therefore she is well off. Don't you see? She has a red rag tied to her leg, which is something very grand and a great honor for a duck. It shows that everyone is anxious not to lose her, and that she is to be noticed by both man and beast. Come, now, don't turn in your toes. A well-bred duckling spreads his feet wide apart, just like his father and mother, in this way. Now, bend your necks and say quack. The ducklings did as they were bade. But the other ducks stared and said, Look, here comes another brood, as if there were not enough of us already. And, bless me, what a queer-looking object one of them is. We don't want him here. And then one flew out and bit him on the neck. Let him alone, said the mother. He's not doing any harm. Yes, but he is so big and ugly. He's a perfect fright, said the spiteful duck, and therefore he must be turned out. A little biting will do him good. But the others are very pretty children, said the old duck with a rag on her leg. All but that one. I wish his mother could smooth him up a bit. He really is ill-favored. That's impossible, your grace, replied the mother. He's not pretty, but he has a very good disposition, and swims as well as the others, or even better. I think he will grow up pretty, and perhaps be smaller. He has remained too long in the egg, and therefore his figure is not properly formed. And then she stroked his neck, and smoothed the feathers, saying, It is a drake, and therefore not of so much consequence. I think he will grow up strong and be able to take care of himself. The other ducklings are graceful enough, said the old duck. Now, make yourself at home, and if you find an eel's head, you can bring it to me. And so they made themselves comfortable. But the poor duckling who had crept out of his shell last of all and looked so ugly was bitten and pushed and made fun of, not only by the ducks, but by all the poultry. He's too big, they all said. And the turkey cock, who had been born into the world with spurs and fancied himself really an emperor, puffed himself out like a vessel in full sail and flew at the duckling. He became quite red in the head with passion, so that the poor little thing did not know where to go, and was quite miserable because he was so ugly as to be laughed at by the whole farmyard. So it went on from day to day. It got worse and worse. The poor duckling was driven away by everyone. Even his brothers and sisters were unkind to him and would say, Ah, you're an ugly creature. I wish the cat would get you. And his mother had been heard to say she wished he had never been born. The ducks pecked him, the chickens beat him, and the girl who fed the poultry pushed him with her feet. So at last he ran away, frightening the little birds in the hedge as he flew over the palings. They are afraid because I am so ugly, he said. So he flew still farther, until he came out onto a large moor inhabited by wild ducks. Here he remained the whole night, feeling very sorrowful. In the morning, when the wild ducks rose in the air, they stared at their new comrade. What sort of duck are you, they all said, coming round him. He bowed to them, and was as polite as he could be, but he did not reply to their question. You are exceedingly ugly, said the wild ducks, but that will not matter if you do not want to marry one of our family. Poor thing. He had no thoughts of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes and drink some of the water on the moor. After he had been on the moor 2 days, there came 2 wild geese, or rather goslings, for they had not been out of the egg long, which accounts for their impertinence. Listen, friend, said one of them to the duckling. You are so ugly that we like you very well. Will you go with us and become a bird of passage? Not far from here is another moor, in which there are some wild geese, all of them unmarried. It is a chance for you to get a wife. You may make your fortune, ugly as you are. Bang! Bang! Sounded in the air, and the 2 wild geese fell dead among the rushes, and the water was tinged with blood. Bang! Bang! Echoed far and wide in the distance, and the whole flocks of wild geese rose up from the rushes. The sound continued from every direction, for the sportsmen surrounded the moor, and some were even seated on branches of the trees overlooking the rushes. The blue smoke from the guns rose like clouds over the dark trees, and as it floated away across the water, a number of sporting dogs bounded among the rushes, which bent beneath them wherever they went. How they terrified the poor duckling! He turned away his head to hide it under his wing, and at the same moment a large, terrible dog passed quite near him. His jaws were open, his tongue hung from his mouth, and his eyes glared fearfully. He thrust his nose close to the duckling, showing his sharp teeth, and then, splash, splash, he went into the water without touching him. "Oh," sighed the duckling, "how thankful I am for being so ugly. Even a dog will not bite me." And so he lay quite still while the shots rattled through the rushes and gun after gun was fired over him. It was late in the day before all became quiet. But even then the poor young thing did not dare to move. He waited quietly for several hours, and then, after looking carefully around him, hastened away from the moor as fast as he could. He ran over the field and meadow till a storm arose and he could hardly struggle against it. Towards evening he reached a poor little cottage that seemed ready to fall and only seemed to be standing because it could not decide on which side to fall first. The storm continued so violent that the duckling could go no further. He sat down by the cottage, and then he noticed that the door was not quite closed, in consequence of one of the hinges having given way. There was, therefore, a narrow opening near the bottom, large enough for him to slip through, which he did very quietly, and got a shelter for the night. Here, in this cottage, lived a woman, a cat, and a hen. The cat, whom the mistress called my little son, was a great favorite. He would raise his back and purr, and could even throw out sparks from his fur if it was stroked the wrong way. The hen had very short legs, so she was called Chickie Shortlegs. She laid good eggs, and her mistress loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning the strange visitor was discovered. The cat began to purr, and the hen to cluck. "What is all that noise about?" said the old woman, looking around the room. But her sight was not very good. Therefore, when she saw the duckling, she thought it must be a fat duck that had strayed from home. "Oh, what a prize!" she exclaimed. "I hope it is not a drake, for then I shall have some duck eggs. I must wait and see." So the duckling was allowed to remain on trial for 3 weeks, but there were no eggs. Now the cat was the master of the house, and the hen was the mistress, and they always said that we and the world, for they believed themselves to be half of the world, and by far the better half too. The duckling thought that others might hold a different opinion on the subject, but the hen would not listen to such doubts. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then have the goodness to cease talking." "Can you raise your back or purr or throw out sparks?" said the cat. "No." "Then you have no right to express an opinion when sensible people are speaking." So the duckling sat in a corner, feeling very low-spirited, and when the sunshine and fresh air came into the room through the open door, he began to feel such a great longing for a swim that he could not help speaking of it. "What an absurd idea," said the hen. "You have nothing else to do, therefore you have foolish fancies. If you could purr or lay eggs, they would pass away." "But it is so delightful to swim about on the water," said the duckling, "and so refreshing to feel it close over your head while you dive down to the bottom." "Delightful, indeed! It must be a queer sort of pleasure," said the hen. "Why, you must be crazy. Ask the cat. He is the cleverest animal I know. Ask him how he would like to swim about on the water or dive under it, for I will not speak of my own opinion. Ask our mistress, the old woman. There is no one in the world more clever than she is. Do you think she would relish swimming and letting the water close over her head?" "I see you don't understand me," said the duckling. "We don't understand you? Who can understand you, I wonder? Do you consider yourself more clever than the cat or the old woman? I will say nothing of myself. Don't imagine such nonsense, child, and thank your good fortune that you have been so well received here. Are you not in a warm room and in society from which you can learn something? But you are a chatterer, and your company is not very agreeable. Believe me, I speak only for your own good. I may tell you unpleasant truths, but that is a proof of my friendship. I advise you, therefore, to lay eggs and to learn to purr as quickly as possible. I believe I must go out into the world again, said the duckling. Yes, do, said the hen. So the duckling left the cottage and soon found water on which it could swim and dive. But he was avoided by all the other animals because of his ugly appearance. Autumn came, and the leaves in the forest turned to orange and gold. Then, as winter approached, the wind caught them as they fell and whirled them into the cold air. The clouds, heavy with hail and snowflakes, hung low in the sky, and the raven stood among the reeds crying, "Croak, croak." It made one shiver with cold to look at him. All this was very sad for the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun was setting amid radiant clouds, there came a large flock of beautiful birds out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen any like them before. They were swans, and they curved their graceful necks, while their soft plumage shone with dazzling whiteness. They uttered a singular cry as they spread their glorious wings and flew away from these cold regions to warmer countries across the sea. They mounted higher and higher in the air, and the ugly little duckling had a strange sensation as he watched them. He whirled himself in the water like a wheel, stretched out his neck towards them, and uttered a cry so strange that it frightened even himself. Could he ever forget those beautiful, happy birds? And when at last they were out of his sight, he dived under the water and rose again, almost beside himself with excitement. He knew not the names of these birds, nor where they had flown, but he felt towards them as he had never felt towards any other bird in the world. He was not envious of these beautiful creatures. It never occurred to him to wish to be as lovely as they. Poor ugly creature! How gladly he would have lived even with the ducks had they only treated him kindly and given him encouragement. The winter drew colder and colder. He was obliged to swim about in the water to keep it from freezing, but every night the space upon which he swam became smaller and smaller. At length it froze so hard that the ice in the water crackled as he moved, and the duckling had to paddle with his legs as well as he could to keep the space from closing up. He became exhausted at last, and lay still and helpless, frozen fast in the ice. Early in the morning, a peasant who was passing by saw what had happened. He broke the ice in pieces with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to his wife. The warmth revived the poor little creature, but when the children wanted to play with him, the duckling thought they would do him some harm. So he started up in terror, fluttered into the milk pan, and splashed the milk around the room. Then the woman clapped her hands, which frightened him still more. He flew first into the butter cask, and then into the meal tub, and out again. What a condition he was in! The woman screamed and struck at him with the tongs. The children laughed and screamed and tumbled over each other in their efforts to catch him. But luckily he escaped. The door stood open, and the poor creature could just manage to slip out among the bushes and lie down quite exhausted in the new fallen snow. It would be very sad were I to relate all the misery and privations which the poor little duckling endured during that hard winter. But when it had passed, he found himself lying one morning in a moor, amongst the rushes. He felt the warm sun shining, and heard the lark singing, and saw that all around was beautiful spring. Then the young bird felt that his wings were strong, and as he flapped them against his side and rose high into the air, they bore him onwards until, before he knew how it had happened, he found himself in a large garden. The apple trees were in full blossom, and the fragrant elders bent their long green branches down to the stream, which wound round a smooth lawn. Everything looked beautiful in the freshness of early spring. From a thicket close by came 3 beautiful white swans, rustling their feathers and swimming lightly over the smooth water. The duckling saw these lovely birds and felt more strangely unhappy than ever. "I will fly to these royal birds," he exclaimed, "and they will kill me because, ugly as I am, I dare to approach them. But it does not matter. Better to be killed by them than pecked by the ducks, beaten by the hens, pushed about by the maiden who feeds the poultry, or starved with hunger in the winter." Then he flew to the water and swam towards the beautiful swans. The moment they espied the stranger, they rushed to meet him with outstretched wings. "Kill me," said the poor bird, and he bent his head down to the surface of the water and awaited death. But what did he see in the clear stream below? His own image. No longer a dark gray bird, ugly and disagreeable to look at, but a graceful and beautiful swan. To be born in a duck's nest in a farmyard is of no consequence to a bird if it is hatched from a swan's egg. He now felt glad at having suffered sorrow and trouble because it enabled him to enjoy so much better all the pleasure and happiness around him. For the great swans swam round the newcomer and stroked his neck with their beaks as a welcome. Into the garden presently came some little children, and threw bread and cake into the water. "See," cried the youngest, "there is a new one." And the rest were delighted, and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, "There is another swan come! A new one has arrived!" Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, "The new one is the most beautiful at all. He is so young and pretty." And the old swans bowed their heads before him. Then he felt quite ashamed, and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, and yet he was not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all the birds. Even the elder tree bent down its boughs into the water before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rustled his feathers, curved his slender neck, and cried joyfully from the depths of his heart, "I never dreamed of such happiness as this while I was despised as the ugly duckling." This was The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen, read by David Anderson.
How the Whale Got His Throat, from Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the sea, once upon a time, O my best beloved, there was a whale, and he ate fishes. He ate the starfish, and the garfish, and the crab, and the dab, and the plaice, and the dace, and the skate and his mate, and the mackerel, and the pickerel, and the really truly twirly-whirly eel. All the fishes he could find in all the sea he ate with his mouth. So, till at last there was only one small fish left in all the sea, and he was a small 'stute fish, and he swam a little behind the whale's right ear, so as to be out of harm's way. Then the whale stood up on his tail and said, "I'm hungry." And the small 'stute fish said in a small 'stute voice, "Noble and generous cetacean, have you ever tasted man?" "No," said the whale. "What is it like?" "Nice," said the small 'stute fish. "Nice, but nubbly." "Then fetch me some," said the whale, and he made the sea froth up with his tail. "One at a time is enough," said the 'stute fish. "If you swim to latitude 50 north, longitude 40 west, that's magic. you will find sitting on a raft in the middle of the sea with nothing on but a pair of blue canvas breeches, a pair of suspenders. You must not forget the suspenders, best beloved. And a jackknife, one shipwrecked mariner, who, it is only fair to tell you, is a man of infinite resource and sagacity. So the whale swam and swam to latitude 50 north, longitude 40 west, as fast as he could swim, and, on a raft, in the middle of the sea, with nothing to wear except a pair of blue canvas breeches, a pair of suspenders, you must particularly remember the suspenders, best beloved, and a jackknife, he found one single, solitary, shipwrecked mariner, trailing his toes in the water. He had his mummy's leave to paddle, or else he would never have done it, because he was a man of infinite resource and sagacity. Then the whale opened his mouth back and back and back, till it nearly touched his tail, and he swallowed the shipwrecked mariner, and the raft he was sitting on, and his blue canvas breeches, and the suspenders, which you must not forget, and the jackknife. He swallowed them all down into his warm, dark inside cupboards, and then he smacked his lips, so, and turned round 3 times on his tail. But as soon as the mariner, who was a man of infinite resource and sagacity, found himself truly inside the whale's warm, dark inside cupboards, he stumped and he jumped, and he thumped and he bumped, and he pranced and he danced, and he banged and he clanged, and he hit and he bit, and he leaped and he creeped, and he prowled and he howled, and he hopped and he dropped, and he cried and he sighed, and he crawled and he bawled, and he stepped and he leapt, and he danced hornpipes where he shouldn't, and the whale felt most unhappy indeed. Have you forgotten the suspenders? So he said to the 'Stute Fish, "This man is very nubbly, and besides he's making me hiccup. What shall I do?" "Tell him to come out," said the 'Stute Fish. So the whale called down his own throat to the shipwrecked mariner, "Come out and behave yourself. I've got the hiccups." "Nay, nay," said the mariner, "not so, but far otherwise. Take me to my natal shores and the white cliffs of Albion, and I'll think about it." And he began to dance more than ever. "You'd better take him home," said the 'Stute Fish to the whale. "I ought to have warned you that he is a man of infinite resource and sagacity." So the whale swam and swam and swam, with both flippers in his tail, as hard as he could for the hiccups, and at last he saw the mariner's natal shore and the white cliffs of Albion, and he rushed halfway up the beach and opened his mouth wide and wide and wide, and said, "Change here for Winchester, Ashuelot, Nasha, Keene, and stations on the Fitchburg Road." And just as he said "Fitch," the mariner walked out of his mouth. But while the whale had been swimming, the mariner, who was indeed a person of infinite resource and sagacity, had taken his jackknife and cut up the raft into a little square grating all running crisscross, and he had tied it firm with his suspenders. Now you know why you were not to forget the suspenders. And he dragged that grating good and tight into the whale's throat, and there it stuck. Then he recited the following sloka, which, as you have not heard it, I will now proceed to relate. "By means of a grating, I have stopped your aiding." For the mariner, he was also an Hibernian, and he stepped out on the shingle and went home to his mother, who had given him leave to trail his toes in the water, and he married and lived happily ever afterward. So did the whale. But from that day on, the grating in his throat, which he could neither cough up nor swallow down, prevented him eating anything except very, very small fish, and that is the reason why whales nowadays never eat men or boys or little girls. The small 'Stute Fish went and hid himself in the mud under the door-sills of the equator. He was afraid that the whale might be angry with him. The sailor took the jackknife home. He was wearing the blue canvas breeches when he walked out on the shingle. The suspenders were left behind, you see, to tie the grating with. And that is the end of that tale. When the cabin portholes are dark and green because of the seas outside, when the ship goes whap with a waggle between, and the steward falls into the soup tureen, and the trunks begin to slide, when Nursey lies on the floor in a heap, and Mummy tells you to let her sleep, and you aren't waked or washed or dressed, why, then you'll know, if you haven't guessed, you're 50 north and 40 west. End of How the Whale Got His Throat by Rudyard Kipling. Recording by Owlivia.